Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. I was driving home late at night after a long shift. The roads empty, and the only sound being the hum of my tires against the pavement. The sky was dark, dotted with a few scattered stars, and the only light was from my headlights. My eyes were heavy, and I struggled to stay alert, but the thought of getting home and crawling into bed kept me going. The quiet night was peaceful, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the day I had just left behind. As I drove, I noticed a car behind me in the rearview mirror, its headlights shining bright and steady. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another driver on a late-night commute. But then, after a few moments, I noticed something strange. The car behind me flashed its high beams. It was a quick burst of light, bright enough to make me squint. I felt a twinge of annoyance, assuming the driver was impatient or in a hurry. I kept my speed steady, thinking that maybe they would pass me soon, but they didn't. Instead, the car behind me continued to flash its high beams in a rapid, irregular pattern. It wasn't the usual impatient flashing of someone wanting to pass. It was persistent, almost deliberate. My pulse quickened, a sense of unease creeping up my spine. I was the only one on the road, and the last thing I wanted was trouble this late at night. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, trying to get a better look at the vehicle behind me. It was a dark-colored sedan, its headlights now blindingly bright. The flashing continued, and I could feel my anxiety start to build. Was this some kind of prank? A warning? Or was the driver trying to signal something? I wasn't sure, but the thought of pulling over to let them pass seemed like the safest option. I wasn't going to keep driving with my eyes constantly strained against the lights in the mirror. I decided to take the next exit off the highway, pulling onto a quieter side road that ran parallel to the main route. The car behind me followed closely, the headlights staying locked on my rearview mirror. My heart started to race a little faster. Why were they following me so closely? I had pulled off to the side, and yet the car still remained right behind me, its lights blinding in the darkness. I slowed down as I looked for a place to pull over, a little part of me hoping the driver would get the hint and move on. But no, the car remained in tow, unwavering. There were no other cars in sight, and the road stretched out in front of us like an empty, desolate path. It felt like I was being stalked, and the isolation made it even worse. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I glanced at the side mirror, noting that the car's headlights were still right there. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to pull over completely and let the car pass, thinking that maybe I could get some space and drive on without being harassed. I veered off to the shoulder, making sure to keep my car out of the way as I came to a stop. I hoped that when the car passed, the flashing would stop, and I could continue my drive in peace. But instead of passing, the car behind me slowed down as well. I froze for a second, my heart pounding in my chest. The lights in the rearview mirror dimmed, and I watched, tense, as the car behind me came to a halt as well, its headlights now off. A chill ran through me. Why hadn't they passed? Why were they waiting? I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The car was still behind me, and I could feel my breath coming faster. I debated what to do. Should I drive off again, or should I just stay still? But the stillness of the situation felt unnerving, and my thoughts started to spiral. What if something was wrong? What if they were waiting for me to make a move? I dared not turn around to look directly at the other car, but I could feel the presence of the vehicle behind me, the emptiness of the night amplifying the tension. The seconds dragged on like hours. I glanced at my rearview mirror again, but the car was just sitting there, motionless, its headlights off and the darkness of the night swallowing up the road between us. Finally, after what seemed like an agonizing wait, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer, in this silent standoff. I needed to get out of there. Slowly, cautiously, I pressed the gas pedal, moving forward just a few feet. The car behind me remained stationary, waiting. I turned my head slightly to check again, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The moment I moved, the car behind me slowly started to follow. Their headlights flicked on again, and the car began trailing me at a distance, but it didn't increase speed. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more unsettled. The car kept a steady distance, its headlights glaring at me, never deviating, as if it was attached to my every move. I felt like I was part of some twisted game that I couldn't escape. I didn't know what the driver's intentions were, but my instincts screamed at me to drive faster. I picked up the pace, the sound of my tires against the road growing louder. The car behind me matched my speed. It wasn't just following anymore, it was pacing me. I turned a sharp corner, hoping the vehicle would get the hint and go away. But no, it turned too. The car was still on my tail. My stomach churned with fear, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to get to a more populated area. I didn't want to lead them to my home. Didn't want them to know where I lived. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, and not just by some ordinary driver. After what felt like forever, I finally spotted the lights of a busy intersection in the distance. I was nearing the city, and the familiar sights of streetlights and signs reassured me, even if just a little. The car behind me, still following like a shadow, didn't seem to break its pace. But when I approached the lights, I made a quick turn into a brightly lit gas station parking lot, hoping the car wouldn't follow. To my surprise, the car didn't follow me into the lot. Instead, it stopped at the edge of the street, its headlights still fixed on me for a few moments before they blinked off. I could feel my breath catching in my chest, and I didn't dare move until I saw the car's taillights disappear down the street. I sat in my car for a few more minutes, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what had just happened, but the feeling of being watched, stalked, haunted me long after the car had gone. I never saw that vehicle again, but every time I drive home late at night, a part of me still looks in the rearview mirror, just in case. Story 2. The hospital was quiet that night, like it always was during the graveyard shift. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above me as I sat behind the nurse's station, going through patient charts and answering calls. The rhythmic beeping of the machines in the ICU and the occasional shuffle of footsteps echoed through the hallways. But other than that, the night was uneventful. I had grown used to the solitude of the night shift, the stillness that seemed to stretch on for hours. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed him. At first, I thought I had imagined it. A man, dressed in a hospital gown, walking slowly down the corridor near the emergency room. He didn't seem to be in any hurry, and there was something unsettling about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, almost as if he was lost. I looked at the clock, then back at the hallway, wondering if I had missed something. He wasn't one of our patients. I stood up and checked the patient log, flipping through the pages. No one matching his description had been admitted recently. I glanced at the staff list, but I didn't recognize the man either. It wasn't uncommon for family members or visitors to wander the halls, but something about him felt different. The hospital was empty, and most patients were either asleep or resting in their rooms. Curiosity pulled me from the nurse's station as I stepped into the hallway. The man was still walking, his bare feet making no sound on the linoleum floor. He was hunched over, his head down, and his gown was slightly torn at the edges. There was a pale, almost ghostly quality to him, his skin an unnatural shade under the harsh lights. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine as I watched him, my breath catching in my throat. I called out to him, "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you?" But he didn't respond. His head remained lowered, his movements mechanical, as though he hadn't heard me. I took a few tentative steps forward, unsure of what to do. He was still walking, but now he was moving toward the stairwell at the end of the hall. That was odd. The emergency stairwell was for staff use only, and patients weren't allowed to be near it unless they were being escorted. I reached for the intercom button to call for security, but before I could speak, the man turned sharply into the stairwell. His movements were quick, almost unnaturally so. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, and I was left standing in the hallway, staring at the empty space where he had been. I hesitated for a moment before rushing over to the stairwell door. I pulled it open and called out into the darkness, "Hello, are you okay?" But there was no answer. The stairwell was empty. I checked the floor above and below, but there was no sign of him. He couldn't have gotten very far. Panic started to set in as I realized I had no idea where he had gone. I stepped back into the hallway, my mind racing. Had he been real? Maybe it was just a trick of the light or my exhaustion playing tricks on me, but something told me that wasn't the case. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I called security, my voice a little unsteady as I explained the situation. "I think there's a man in a hospital gown wandering the halls. I saw him near the emergency room, and then he disappeared into the stairwell. No one has admitted him." The security officer on the other end sounded confused, but assured me they would be on their way. I waited by the stairs, my nerves frayed, as the minutes ticked by. When security arrived, they checked the stairwell and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of the man. They even checked the security footage, but according to the cameras, the hallway had been empty the entire time. They were perplexed. There was no explanation for his disappearance, and no one else had reported seeing him. After a few more minutes of searching, security left, telling me to call them again if I saw anything unusual. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. It didn't make sense. How could someone just vanish like that? And why hadn't anyone else seen him? The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't focus on my work. My mind kept returning to that man, to the way he had moved, to the way he disappeared so effortlessly. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, my mind spinning with unanswered questions. Over the next few days, I tried to put the incident out of my mind, but every time I walked down that hallway, I couldn't help but glance over at the stairwell. I even asked the other nurses if they had seen anything unusual during their shifts, but no one else had. The man had simply disappeared. A week later, during another overnight shift, I saw him again. This time he was standing by the elevators near the lobby, just staring at the doors. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't seem to notice me this time. His head tilted slightly to the side as if listening to something only he could hear. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. But before I could even think to approach him, he turned and walked toward the exit doors. I quickly grabbed my phone and called security again. This time I didn't wait to see what happened. I stayed behind the nurse's station, my hands shaking as I tried to stay calm. Security arrived minutes later, but once again, by the time they reached the lobby, the man was gone. There were no cameras in the lobby, so there was no way to track his movements. This time I was certain I wasn't imagining things. He was real, but no one else had ever seen him. No one could explain where he came from or how he kept slipping through our defenses. Was he a ghost, a hallucination, or something else entirely? I didn't know, but I had started to believe that there was something wrong with that man. Something that didn't belong in the hospital. Story 3. It was a typical Tuesday when I took my car in for its regular oil change. I'd been putting it off for a while, but the car had started to sound a little off, so I figured it was time. The garage was busy, with a couple of other cars waiting for their turn, so I grabbed a coffee from the vending machine and sat in the small, cluttered waiting area. The radio played softly in the background, but my mind wandered as I flipped through an old magazine. About an hour later, the mechanic came in, his face unusually serious. He asked if I was the owner of the silver sedan outside, and I nodded, feeling a little uneasy. "We found something strange under your car," he said, his tone low. I froze, expecting to hear something about a broken part or a potential repair, but instead he handed me a small, weathered metal object. At first I didn't recognize it. It was no bigger than a fist with sharp, jagged edges and a series of wires and small lights attached to it. The mechanic explained that it was a GPS tracker. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the device, not sure what to make of it. "This doesn't belong here," he added, his voice tinged with concern. I could barely process what he was saying. A GPS tracker. On my car. I had no enemies, no reason for someone to track my movements. I hadn't noticed anything strange lately, no unusual cars following me or any signs of people tailing me. But there it was, clear as day, attached to the undercarriage of my vehicle. The mechanic seemed just as bewildered as I was. He said it didn't look like a factory-installed part, and the wiring was done in a sloppy, haphazard way. "Whoever put it there didn't exactly try to hide it well," he remarked, his eyes narrowing as he examined the device. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that someone had been watching me. I couldn't help but feel exposed. The idea that someone had been tracking my every move was unsettling. How long had it been there? Who had put it there? I thought back over the past few weeks, trying to remember if anything unusual had happened. I hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. The only thing that came to mind was a random car that had been parked behind me for a few days last month, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The mechanic offered to disconnect the tracker, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I didn't know what the device was for or who might have placed it there. I told him to leave it for now while I figured out what to do. He gave me a sympathetic look before heading back to the garage, leaving me to stew in my thoughts. I sat in the waiting area, my hands trembling slightly as I stared at the small device in front of me. I tried to calm myself, rationalize the situation. Maybe it was a mistake, a mix-up. Maybe it was some sort of error or malfunction. But something deep in my gut told me it wasn't that simple. The car had been parked in the same spot for the past few weeks, usually in my driveway or at work. But someone had been able to slip under it without me noticing, attach this device, and leave without a trace. How had they done it without me hearing? And why hadn't I noticed anything suspicious? When the mechanic returned, he handed me the keys and said everything else was fine with the car. I tried to listen to him, but my mind kept racing. He said he'd reported the tracker to the police, but I wasn't sure how much help they would be. It wasn't like someone had left a note or a clear message. It was just the tracker, a silent watcher under my car. I drove home that afternoon, my thoughts swirling. I hadn't noticed any strange cars or any new people in my life. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened in the past few months. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone knew where I was at all times. I couldn't help but check my rearview mirror every time I made a turn, half expecting to see someone tailing me. The next few days passed in a blur of unease. I couldn't bring myself to check the tracker, terrified of what I might discover if I did. The thought of someone monitoring my every move made me feel like I was suffocating. I started taking different routes to work, avoiding the usual places I frequented. It was exhausting, but the paranoia was slowly eating away at me. I even went so far as to change my routine. I started parking my car in different spots when I went out, hoping that whoever had placed the tracker wouldn't be able to keep up. But the anxiety didn't subside. If anything, it grew worse with each passing day. Every time I got in the car, I was hyper aware of the possibility that someone might be following me. After a week, I couldn't take it any longer. I drove to the police station and reported the tracker, hoping they could offer some insight, or at least track down the device. The officer who took my statement seemed sympathetic, but she didn't seem particularly hopeful. "We'll do what we can," she said, taking down the details, "but you'll need to be patient. These things don't always lead to immediate answers." I left the station feeling no better than when I had entered. The thought of waiting, not knowing who was behind this or why they were doing it, was unbearable. The tracker had been placed with such precision, such care. It wasn't just some random act. Someone had been watching me for a reason, and I had no idea what that reason was. The next few days passed with little progress. The police had traced the device to a general area but couldn't pinpoint exactly who had planted it. No one seemed to know anything. I started to feel like I was losing control, like the walls were closing in around me. The paranoia set in deeper, turning every trip outside into a stressful ordeal. Then, one evening, I received a call from the mechanic. He said the police had contacted him for additional information, but there was something he thought I should know. The tracker had been programmed to deactivate after a set period of time. Whoever had placed it on my car had clearly been monitoring me, but their watch had come to an end. I didn't know if that was supposed to make me feel better or worse. The fact that someone had been watching me, tracking my every movement, made my skin crawl. And now the device was gone, leaving only questions. Who had done this? Why had they chosen me? I couldn't answer those questions, but the fear, the unease, remained. Story 4. I had just finished a long day of driving, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, when I pulled into the small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place you only choose when you're desperate or too tired to care about quality. The neon sign flickered in the distance, casting a dim red glow across the cracked pavement. The motel office was dark, with only a few lights flickering inside, but the door was unlocked, and the receptionist, an older man with a weary look, handed me a key without a word. The room was exactly what I expected: worn carpet, peeling wallpaper, and the faint smell of stale air. I tossed my bag onto the bed and took a deep breath, glad to finally rest. There was a musty smell in the room, but nothing I couldn't tolerate for one night. I locked the door behind me, pulled the curtain shut, and sat down in front of the mirror near the bathroom sink, feeling the weight of the day settle on me. As I sat there, adjusting the straps of my backpack, something unusual caught my eye. The mirror was too clean, too perfectly polished compared to the rest of the room. But it wasn't the cleanliness that made me look again. It was the faint red light blinking from the edge of the mirror. I froze, my eyes narrowing as I tried to make sense of it. It wasn't the kind of light you would expect in a normal room, no alarm or light fixture, nothing visible. I stood up and stepped closer to the mirror, trying to find where the light was coming from. At first, I thought it might have been some kind of malfunctioning light from the hotel signs outside, but the more I stared at it, the more it felt deliberate. like it was placed there on purpose. The light blinked in rhythmic intervals, and with each flash my heart began to beat a little faster. I reached out and touched the mirror, expecting it to be cool, but it felt slightly warm under my fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I examined the mirror more closely, running my hands along the edges, looking for any signs of irregularities or gaps. That's when I noticed the small indentation at the top left corner of the frame, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I pressed gently, and to my shock, the mirror shifted ever so slightly, revealing a small hole in the wall behind it. My stomach twisted with unease as I stared at the hole, my mind racing. The blinking light was no longer just a strange coincidence, it was a red flag. I leaned in closer, trying to get a better look at the hole, and that's when I saw it. A small black lens, hidden just behind the mirror, and the unmistakable glow of a camera's red recording light. My blood ran cold. There, hidden behind the polished surface of the mirror, was a camera. It was pointed directly at me, silently recording my every move. I stepped back, my breath coming faster now as the reality of what I was seeing began to sink in. I was being watched. Someone had been watching me, even though I was supposed to be alone in this cheap motel room. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the rest of the room for any other signs of surveillance, but nothing else seemed out of place. The furniture was standard, nothing unusual, nothing that could give away another hidden camera. Still, my heart raced as I tried to calm myself down. Could I be overreacting? Maybe the camera was part of some security system for the motel, but something in my gut told me that wasn't the case. I needed to get out of there, but my legs felt like lead. I quickly grabbed my phone and tried to search for any information about the motel online, but the Wi-Fi was slow and the connection kept cutting in and out. I couldn't trust the staff either. There was something off about the way the receptionist handed me the key without a word. It all felt too calculated, like I had been led here for a reason. I took a few deep breaths, trying to steady my hands. I needed to get proof, but I also needed to leave before things escalated. I grabbed my bag, hurriedly stuffing it with my belongings, and walked toward the door, my eyes still darting back at the mirror. My mind raced with thoughts of what I should do. Should I confront the receptionist? Should I call the police? But then, what if the camera was just a harmless part of the motel's security? I walked out the door, my pulse hammering in my chest. The parking lot was almost completely empty, with only one or two other cars scattered around. I made my way to my car, feeling the eyes of the hidden camera still on me. Once inside, I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, trying to collect myself. My thoughts were jumbled, but I knew I couldn't stay another second in that room. I glanced back at the motel as I started the engine, the red neon sign flickering in the distance. Was I overreacting? Was it possible that I had just imagined the camera, that it was something else entirely? But no. The feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I could still picture that blinking red light, the camera hidden just behind the mirror, recording every move I made. As I drove away, the motel receded into the distance, but the unease stayed with me, gnawing at my mind. I couldn't shake the thought that someone somewhere had been watching me, waiting for me to slip up. What had they planned? Why was I the one being watched? These questions remained unanswered, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never stay in a motel like that again. The red light would haunt me for a long time. The next day, I filed a complaint with the local authorities, though I wasn't sure how much they would be able to do. The motel didn't have a website, and the receptionist couldn't be reached by phone. The investigation went nowhere. I never went back to that town, but every time I stayed at a motel from then on, I found myself checking the mirrors just in case. Story 5. It had been a long day at work, the kind where I just wanted to get home and collapse into bed. I decided to take a different route home that night, hoping to shake off the exhaustion by avoiding the usual traffic. The streets were quiet, the city just beginning to cool down after the afternoon heat. As I turned onto a smaller side street, I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye, a trail of something scattered on the ground in the alley ahead. I slowed down, curiosity getting the best of me. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I certainly didn't expect to find a line of photos lying in the street, one after another. I pulled over and stepped out of my car, the quiet of the night pressing down on me. My heart began to race as I crouched down to pick up the first photo, the faded edges of the image slightly curled from exposure to the elements. The photo was of me, unmistakably, leaving work earlier that day. I was carrying my coffee cup, walking briskly down the street towards my car. The image was crisp, too perfect, and something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a dumpster or the nearby buildings. But the alley was empty, silent. I took another step forward, and there was another Polaroid on the ground. This one was from just a few minutes after the first, showing me again, though this time I was in the parking lot, unlocking my car. I felt my pulse quicken. There was no way this was a coincidence. The photos were clearly taken by someone who had been watching me. I bent down to pick it up, my hands shaking as I did so, trying to make sense of the situation. The third photo was even more unsettling. It showed me driving down the road, passing a streetlight. The angle of the shot suggested it had been taken from somewhere near the curb, or possibly from inside a parked car. Whoever was following me had been close, too close for comfort. I stood up slowly, my mind racing as I scanned the alley again. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no discarded belongings, nothing out of the ordinary. Just me and the photos. I continued down the alley, each new Polaroid more disorienting than the last. The fourth photo showed me turning onto this very street, the one I was now walking on. The next photo was of me walking toward the alley. How had they known I'd changed my route tonight? How could they have anticipated my every move? It felt like I was being stalked, like someone had orchestrated this entire encounter. By the time I reached the end of the alley, I had a pile of photos in my hands. They were scattered in a way that made it look like a trail, leading me forward as if I were being guided deeper into the darkened street. Each photo was of me, taken at various points throughout the day: when I left my office, when I entered a cafe for lunch, when I walked down the block to catch my bus. They were all from different moments, but they all shared one thing in common. Someone had been watching me, following me, every step of the way. I could feel my stomach turning, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I needed to get out of there. I turned on my heels and started to walk back toward my car, my breath quick and shallow. But as I retraced my steps, something caught my eye, another Polaroid, stuck to the brick wall of the alley. This one wasn't on the ground with the others, as if it had been placed there deliberately. I walked up to it, my legs stiff with fear, and pulled the photo from the wall. My hands trembled as I stared at it. It was a picture of me, standing in my living room. The window behind me was dark, and I could see my reflection in the glass. But the thing that made my blood run cold wasn't the photo itself, it was the notes scrawled on the back, written in shaky handwriting: "I see you." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, the alley suddenly seeming much darker than before. My heart hammered in my chest as I quickly shoved the photo into my pocket and ran back toward my car. I didn't even look behind me, terrified of what I might see. The photos, the note, everything felt like a message, like someone had been watching me for days. maybe even longer. I fumbled for my keys, my hands slick with sweat as I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I sped off without a second thought, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't know if I was being followed, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every turn, every stoplight, felt like it could be the moment when someone would appear from the shadows, when the person who had been trailing me would finally make their move. I drove for what felt like hours, taking winding roads and back streets, hoping to lose whoever or whatever had been following me. My mind raced, trying to piece together any details I might have missed. Who could it be? Someone I knew? Or a stranger? And why? What was the point of all the photos? Finally, I pulled into my apartment complex, the lights from the building casting a sickly glow across the parking lot. I parked my car and sat there for a few moments, staring out at the empty lot. The weight of the situation pressed on me, and I felt a wave of dizziness come over me. I needed to talk to someone, to tell them what had happened. But who could I trust with something like this? Who would believe me? I grabbed the photos from the passenger seat and stuffed them into my bag before heading inside. As I unlocked the door to my apartment, I hesitated. The feeling of being watched lingered, a gnawing sensation that wouldn't leave. But there was no one there. The apartment was quiet, the same as it always was. Yet even as I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that someone was still out there, waiting. Story 6. The gym was unusually busy that afternoon, a steady hum of voices and clanking weights filling the air. I had just finished a round of stretching and was looking forward to getting in a good cardio session. As I made my way to the treadmill, I noticed a small sticky note on the console, right where I usually set my water bottle. At first, I thought it was just a stray note someone had left behind, but when I picked it up, my stomach dropped. Written in hastily scrawled pen were my license plate number and nothing else. I stared at it for a few seconds, the familiar digits staring back at me as though they were mocking me. My heart skipped a beat as a strange unease crept over me. How could anyone have gotten my license plate number? I was certain I hadn't spoken to anyone about my car that day. I looked around the gym, scanning the crowded space for anyone who seemed to be watching me. A few people were on the machines nearby, and a couple more were lifting weights in the corner, but no one seemed to be paying me any attention. I brushed it off as a strange coincidence at first. Maybe someone had written the number down by mistake or was playing some sort of prank. But as I set the note back on the treadmill, I felt a gnawing sense of discomfort. It wasn't the number itself that bothered me after all. License plate numbers are public information. It was the fact that someone had taken the time to jot it down, leave it on my machine, and then disappear without a trace. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to push the thought aside and focused on my workout. As I began jogging on the treadmill, the rhythmic pounding of my feet against the belt did little to calm my growing anxiety. I kept my eyes on the other gym goers, but my mind kept drifting back to the note. What if someone had been following me here? What if this was part of something bigger? After what felt like an eternity, I finished my run, drenched in sweat and feeling more on edge than ever. I wiped down the treadmill and grabbed my water bottle, but the unease in my chest only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't right. I had to get out of there. I made my way to the locker room, my mind racing. The idea that someone knew my license plate number was unsettling, but what bothered me more was the sense of being watched. I quickly changed into my street clothes and grabbed my gym bag, trying not to glance over my shoulder every few seconds. When I reached the parking lot, I immediately looked around for any signs of strange behavior. The lot was nearly empty, with only a few cars parked in the rows. My car was where I had left it, but I couldn't help feeling like I wasn't alone. As I approached, I checked to see if there was anything unusual. No note, no sign that anyone had touched my vehicle. Still, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine, my hands still trembling slightly. I checked the rearview mirror, scanning the area around me one last time. The parking lot was still mostly empty, and nothing seemed out of place. Yet the feeling that I was being watched lingered, like an invisible presence in the car with me. As I drove home, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, convinced that someone was following me. I couldn't shake the thought of that sticky note, of someone scribbling my license plate number without me knowing. It was such an odd and specific thing to do. Who would even think to write it down? My mind started to spiral, imagining all the ways someone could have been tracking me. When I got home, I double-checked my car. Everything appeared normal. No dents, no scratches, and the note wasn't anywhere to be found. Still, I couldn't let it go. I couldn't stop wondering who had left it there, why they had chosen me, and whether they had been watching me longer than I realized. That night, I locked all the doors and checked the windows twice before going to bed. I kept my phone close, half expecting a strange call or text, but nothing came. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the house, every distant noise had me wide awake. I kept thinking about the note, and that feeling of being watched, and I couldn't shake the anxiety that gnawed at me. The next morning, I decided to take a different route to the gym. I couldn't get the incident out of my head, and I felt uneasy returning to the same place, worried that someone might be waiting for me. As I approached the parking lot, I checked to see if anything seemed off. Nothing appeared strange, but the pit in my stomach remained. I parked in the farthest spot from the gym entrance, just in case. As I stepped out of my car, I scanned the area, again, looking for anything unusual. There was no sign of the sticky note from the day before, and the gym seemed as normal as ever, with people coming and going as usual. But I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been here watching me. As I walked toward the entrance, I caught a glimpse of someone standing near the far corner of the parking lot. They were looking at their phone, their face obscured by the shadow of a large tree. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned my attention back to the gym door. I didn't know if the person had noticed me or not, but the fear that had taken root the day before was now something tangible. I didn't feel safe anymore. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that something was off. Someone had taken an interest in me, and that knowledge made my skin crawl. I spent the rest of the workout trying to stay alert, my mind never fully at ease. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be watching me from the corner of my eye. When I finally left the gym, I kept a close eye on my surroundings. Nothing happened, but the strange feeling remained. I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't the only one who knew my license plate number, and that thought, no matter how irrational it seemed, lingered, making me wonder who might be out there waiting. Story 7. I had just come home from work, tired and ready to collapse on the couch for the evening. The small, quiet apartment complex I lived in was tucked away in a corner of the city, a place that had always felt safe and uneventful. I grabbed my mail from the box, the usual mix of bills and flyers, but one envelope caught my attention. It was unmarked, no return address, no name, just a plain brown envelope. Curious and slightly cautious, I ripped it open. Inside, there was a small USB drive. No note, no explanation, just the drive. My fingers hesitated over it for a moment as my mind raced, wondering if it was some kind of mistake or a weird prank. I tossed the rest of the mail aside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this wasn't right. The apartment felt unusually still as I sat down at my desk, plugging the USB drive into my laptop. A file appeared on the screen, titled simply footage. My heart skipped a beat. Was this some kind of surveillance footage? I couldn't think of any reason anyone would have footage of me, let alone a stranger who had somehow gotten their hands on a USB with it. I clicked the file open, not sure what I was about to see. The video started with a grainy image of my front door, just the corner of it, as if someone had positioned a camera outside my apartment. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart racing, but it wasn't until the footage shifted that I saw myself. There I was, walking into my apartment. I was coming home from the grocery store, carrying bags of food. The footage was from the previous week, just a regular evening. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I realized this person had been watching me. The camera angle was positioned in a way that suggested the person had a clear view of my door, but I hadn't seen anything strange. The video continued to play. It showed me walking around my apartment, putting away groceries, cleaning the kitchen, sitting down at my desk. It wasn't just a few seconds of footage, it was hours. The camera caught every little detail, every movement, every glance I made. I could see myself on screen, oblivious to the fact that someone was recording every moment. I paused the video and stared at the screen, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. How had they gotten this footage? My apartment was on the 3rd floor, and there was no way anyone could have snuck in without me noticing. I had no security cameras, no reason to think someone would be watching me. I didn't know anyone who could have done this. Suddenly, another clip appeared. This one showing my apartment at night. The camera angle was different now, but I could see my bedroom. I was asleep, or at least it looked like I was asleep. The camera zoomed in slowly, capturing every breath, every shift of my body in bed. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This was no accident. Whoever had this footage had been watching me for days, maybe longer. My stomach churned as I fast-forwarded through more footage. It was all the same me, walking around my apartment doing the most mundane things. But as I watched, something stood out. In the corner of the screen, just barely noticeable, there were small, dark figures moving in and out of view. I rewound the footage and watched closely. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Shadowy figures lurking in the corners of my apartment. I slammed my laptop shut, my mind reeling. What was going on? Who was watching me? I felt sick, like my entire life had been invaded, like every corner of my private world was no longer my own. I walked back to my living room, pacing in circles as I tried to calm down. My apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching me. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound from the hallway, made my heart race. I kept glancing over my shoulder, as though expecting to see someone standing there, just out of sight. I had to do something, but I didn't know where to start. The footage was the only clue I had, but it felt like a dead end. I couldn't just go to the police and say, "Someone's been watching me and leaving strange USB drives." How could I explain it without sounding crazy? But I couldn't ignore it. The thought that someone had been in my space, lurking in the shadows, was enough to make me feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The next day, I called the building superintendent and asked if there had been any maintenance done recently. Maybe someone had been in the building and installed hidden cameras. The superintendent assured me there hadn't been any work done in months, that everything was normal. I could feel the frustration building in my chest as I hung up. That night, I decided to go through the footage again. I needed to see if there was any detail I had missed, something that could point me in the right direction. I plugged the USB drive back into my laptop, my fingers trembling. This time I watched the footage carefully, searching for anything that could tell me who was behind it. But as the video played, I noticed something even more disturbing. In the footage, I saw myself walking around my apartment, going about my routine. But there was a moment, just a fleeting moment, when I looked directly at the camera. I could see my reflection in the window. My eyes widened as I saw it. There, standing behind me in the reflection, was a shadowy figure, just out of sight. I couldn't tell if it was real or if I was just imagining things. But the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever had made this footage had been standing right behind me in my apartment while I went about my day. They had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. I closed my laptop again, my mind racing. There was no way I could stay here any longer. I had to leave. But where would I go? Who could I trust? It felt like everything was closing in on me and I had no way of fighting back. I packed a bag, grabbed my phone, and left my apartment without looking back. As I stepped into the hallway, I saw the door across from mine creak open, just slightly. I didn't stop to look, just kept walking. Faster now. I didn't care if someone had seen me, I just needed to get out. I never went back to my apartment. The USB drive and the footage are still in my bag, buried under layers of clothes. I don't know what to do with them. I don't know who's watching me, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never feel safe again. Story 8. The trail was quiet that morning, the kind of solitude I had come to cherish on my solo hikes. The trees towered above me, their leaves rustling gently in the wind, creating a peaceful rhythm that helped me clear my mind. I had planned this trip for weeks, hoping to find a little peace away from the chaos of daily life. With every step, I felt more connected to the wilderness, to the simple pulse of nature that seemed so far removed from everything I knew. I had been hiking for hours, lost in the beauty of the forest, when I came across something odd, a trail marker I didn't recognize. It was an old wooden post, weathered by time, but still standing strong. The familiar painted symbols of previous markers were absent. Instead, carved into the wood were letters scratched deeply into the bark. My name was unmistakable: Melissa. Below it, there was an arrow, pointing deep into the woods. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It felt like a cruel joke, something out of a horror movie, but the longer I stared at the marker, the more real it seemed. I had never seen this trail before, and I certainly hadn't come across a marker with my name on it. No one knew I was hiking here today. I had told a few friends I'd be out on the trails, but nothing more specific. The idea that someone had deliberately carved my name into the post made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I looked around, trying to find any other sign of human presence. The woods were still and silent, as if waiting. The marker was the only thing that seemed out of place. I debated turning around, but something about the arrow beckoned me forward. A strange curiosity gnawed at me, and I found myself stepping closer to the marker, my hand brushing against the rough wood. It felt cold, unnaturally so, and I quickly pulled my hand away. The arrow pointed into the dense forest, leading deeper into a part of the woods I didn't recognize. The trees here were older, their branches twisting in strange directions, like they were trying to keep me from going further. I should have turned back. I knew that. But my feet moved on their own, carried by an inexplicable urge to follow the trail. I couldn't ignore it, couldn't shake the feeling that something important waited for me ahead. The further I went, the more I felt the weight of the forest pressing in around me. It was as if the air itself thickened, the shadows growing deeper, more oppressive. The usual sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling had faded, replaced by a deafening silence. My breath seemed louder now, each inhale too sharp, too clear. I kept my eyes on the ground, trying to focus on the path ahead, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that marker. Who had carved my name? Why? And why here? The questions swirled in my mind, but I couldn't find any answers. The further I walked, the more it felt like I was being led. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. The forest stretched on, endless and uninviting. I came to a small clearing, and for the first time since I had found the marker, I stopped. There, in the center of the clearing, was a large rock, smooth and weathered. Its surface was covered in moss, but it was the shape that caught my attention. It wasn't natural. The rock had been carved, shaped in a way that seemed almost deliberate. As I approached, I saw faint markings on its symbols, etched deeply into the stone, though they weren't any language I recognized. My heart raced as I traced the symbols with my eyes. It felt like something ancient, something forgotten. There was a sense of recognition deep inside me, as if I had seen these symbols before, but I couldn't place where. My hand reached out instinctively, hovering above the carvings. A cold shiver ran through me as I pulled my hand back. I stepped closer, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Why had I come here? Why had I followed the arrow? I tried to calm my breathing, trying to dismiss the unease rising within me. But as I stood there, staring at the markings, I felt a sudden jolt of realization this wasn't random. This was meant for me. My name, the arrow, the stone, everything felt orchestrated, as if I was part of something much larger than I understood. A soft rustling in the trees behind me broke my concentration. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The clearing was empty, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. My eyes darted from tree to tree, but there was nothing. The forest was silent again, as if it had never moved. I exhaled shakily, trying to reassure myself that it was just the wind, just the nerves. I turned back to the rock, feeling a strange pull to it, and there in the center of the stone was a small, round indentation. It looked like a natural part of the rock's shape, but something about it drew me in. Without thinking, I knelt down, my fingers brushing the surface of the stone. The moment I touched it, a low, distant hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground beneath me. My heart skipped a beat. The humming grew louder, and I scrambled back, my mind screaming at me to run. But my legs felt like they were made of lead, and before I knew it, I was rooted in place, unable to move. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, and I looked down, noticing the earth around the rock beginning to tremble. It was as if the forest itself was alive, reacting to my presence. Then, without warning, the hum stopped. The forest went completely still. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly stood, my eyes scanning the surroundings. The marker, the stone, the strange symbols, it all felt like part of something I didn't understand. And the worst part was, I had no idea if I was meant to find it, or if I had walked into something that would never let me leave. I turned, deciding to leave the clearing, but when I looked back at the trail, it had changed. The arrow that had once pointed forward now seemed to point back, toward the place I had just come from. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I wasn't just lost, I was being led. And it felt like the forest was closing in around me, leaving no way out. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was in control of the trail anymore. The forest had its own plan for me, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face whatever it had in store. But I had no choice but to follow, hoping that the path would lead me to an answer before it swallowed me whole. Story 9. I had been traveling for days, and when the rain started to pour heavily, I knew I needed shelter. I saw the old hotel through the fog, its silhouette barely visible against the thick, gray backdrop of the storm. A faded sign hung above the entrance, its letters nearly worn away, the Galloway Hotel. The lobby smelled of mildew and dust, the carpet worn and threadbare, but the woman behind the desk welcomed me with a smile that was a little too bright. "We don't often get visitors this time of night," she said, her voice thin and high-pitched, as though she was speaking from the back of her throat. "But we have a room ready for you." I wasn't sure why, but something about her smile made the hair on my neck stand up. She handed me an old-fashioned key with a brass tag that read Room 14. I nodded, paid her, and made my way up the narrow, creaky stairs. The hallway on the second floor was dimly lit, the light flickering intermittently. My footsteps echoed off the walls as I walked toward my room. The door creaked open as I inserted the key into the lock, and the smell of stale air hit me immediately. The room was small, furnished with a single bed covered in a faded floral duvet. A small desk sat against one wall, and a large mirror hung above it. I tossed my bag onto the bed and went to the bathroom to wash up. The mirror above the sink caught my reflection. The lighting in the room was poor, and shadows clung to the corners, but there was something unsettling about my face. Something in my eyes seemed different. I couldn't quite place it. I shook my head and splashed cold water on my face, dismissing it as exhaustion. When I returned to the room, I noticed the temperature had dropped. It was strange there was no reason for it, as the weather outside hadn't changed. I wrapped myself in a blanket and settled into the bed, hoping to get a good night's sleep before continuing my journey. But sleep didn't come easily. I heard it then, the faintest sound, like whispers coming from the walls. At first I thought it was the wind, but the whispers didn't change direction or grow fainter as wind does. They were constant, coming from within the very structure of the building. It was as if someone or something was whispering just beyond my hearing. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. My pulse quickened. I tried to get up, to leave the room, but the moment I stepped out of bed, I felt the temperature drop even further. The hallway was shrouded in darkness now, the flickering light from earlier completely gone. The whispers seemed to be calling to me, growing clearer with each passing second. They were unmistakably human voices, distorted and unintelligible, but somehow familiar. "Come closer." The voice was a whisper, but it seemed to rattle in my bones like it was inside my head. I froze. Something was wrong. I turned toward the mirror on the wall. The reflection was blurry at first, but as I stared at it, the image of my face became sharper, clearer, and then I saw the shadow behind me. There was no one there. The shadow was something else, something that shouldn't be. It was tall, its form indistinct but looming, with long, thin fingers reaching toward me. My heart raced as I backed away, but the figure didn't move. It stayed in a reflection, staring at me with eyes that were hollow, black pits. I turned around, but when I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. My reflection was normal again, too normal, but something still felt off. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of the room and into the hallway, desperate to find the stairs. But the whispers were louder now. The air felt thick with something I couldn't explain. The walls seemed to shift and warp around me, the dim light flickering even more violently, casting strange, exaggerated shadows. I rushed down the stairs, but the lobby was empty. The woman at the desk was gone. The door was locked, and there was no way out. The temperature in the lobby had dropped so much that I could see my breath fogging in the air. I backed away from the door, but the whispering didn't stop. It wasn't just coming from the walls anymore, it was everywhere. swirling around me, in my ears, my mind. I turned toward the hallway that led to the back of the hotel. There, at the far end, I saw a figure standing in the dark. It was her, the woman from the front desk. But this time, her face was twisted in an expression of pure, mindless horror. Her eyes bulged from her skull, and her lips were drawn back in a grotesque grin. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was waiting. "Leave," she hissed, but her voice wasn't hers anymore. It was the sound of 1,000 voices layered on top of each other. It was almost pleading. I didn't wait to hear any more. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the old floorboards. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out of there before whatever it was caught me. I ran through the back hallways, trying every door, but they were all locked. The whispers were so loud now that I felt like they were tearing at my mind. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled down a dark corridor I hadn't seen before. Then, there it was, a door, slightly ajar. I pushed it open. It led to an old maintenance room, filled with rusted pipes and tools. But as I entered, I realized the door didn't close behind me. Instead, the hallway I had just come from was now empty, as though the building itself had shifted, its walls swallowing all evidence of the path I'd just taken. The whispers stopped. But something was waiting in the dark. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. I could sense it, like a presence closing in. I turned back to the door, but it was no longer there. I was trapped. And the whispers had begun again. But this time they were saying my name. Story 10. I had always loved hiking alone. There was something calming about being surrounded by nature. The only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. I had been hiking for years, venturing into different forests, always in search of a new trail or a place that felt untouched. This time I had decided to take a route I'd never been on before. A small trail in the woods far off the beaten path. The locals had warned me that it was an old trail, one people tended to avoid, but that only intrigued me more. The morning was crisp, the kind of coolness that makes you feel alive. I set out early, the sun barely rising over the horizon. The path started off familiar enough: dirt and rocks, trees arching overhead, the smell of damp earth. But as I walked deeper into the forest, I noticed something strange. The woods felt unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, and the air felt heavier, like something was watching. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia. I'd been on plenty of solo hikes before, and I was used to the solitude. But this was different. The trees around me seemed to grow thicker, the trail narrower. The path, which had been easy to follow at first, now seemed to wind unpredictably, like it was leading me somewhere I couldn't understand. And then I saw it. Half buried in the dirt, near the edge of the trail, was an old wooden sign. It was weathered and chipped, the letters barely legible. But I could make out enough to see that it read, "Don't go further." My curiosity piqued. I looked around, but there was no other sign, no warning of any kind. It felt like a message meant just for me, a strange omen in the midst of an otherwise peaceful hike. I hesitated, standing there for a long moment. It would have been easy to turn around, to walk back the way I came. But something about the way the trail seemed to beckon me forward made me press on. I shrugged off the warning and continued down the path, though my steps felt more cautious now. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was crossing into a different world. The trees grew closer together, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The light barely filtered through the dense canopy above, leaving the forest floor in a shadowy gloom. The silence had turned oppressive, as though even the wind was afraid to move through the trees. And then I saw the house. It was small, hidden just off the trail, almost swallowed up by the surrounding trees. It looked abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging in places, and yet it didn't look as though it had been empty for long. The remnants of old furniture were visible through the cracked windows, and the door, though half-rotted, was slightly ajar, as though someone had recently left or just entered. I didn't want to go closer. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to turn around and get out of the woods. But again, I couldn't resist the pull. I was drawn to the house, as if some invisible force was guiding my every step. Slowly, reluctantly, I approached. As I drew near, I noticed something odd. There was a trail of small, dark stains on the ground leading to the house. I bent down to inspect them. They weren't from animals. No, this was something human. Blood. I couldn't be sure, but the realization sent a chill through me. Despite my fear, I couldn't stop myself. I pushed the door open, the creaking sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floor creaked underfoot. In the dim light, I could make out old photographs on the walls, black and white portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. I stepped further into the room, my breath shallow, my heartbeat loud in my ears. The place felt like a time capsule, frozen in an era I couldn't quite place. The air was heavy with something I couldn't quite identify, a faint, acrid smell that made my stomach turn. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling, like footsteps on the floor above me. At first I thought it was just the house settling, the creaks of an old building. But then it came again, this time louder, a definite movement. Something was up there. I froze, my pulse hammering in my throat. I should have left. I should have run. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, rooted to the spot, listening. The footsteps stopped, and there was a long, eerie silence. The air felt colder now, heavier. A whisper of a sound reached my ears, just faint enough to make me question if I had imagined it. But it wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. "Help me." The whisper was faint, almost a breath, but it was unmistakable. It came from upstairs. I had no choice. I had to know what it was. I couldn't leave, not now, not with that voice in my head. My legs moved on their own as I slowly made my way up the creaky stairs. The second floor was even darker than the first, the windows completely covered by rotting boards. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of the shapes that loomed in the corners. Then, in the farthest corner of the room, I saw a figure. A person. They were hunched over, their back to me, their head hanging low, as though they were waiting. I stepped forward, my hand trembling on the railing, and the figure turned. At first I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, but then I saw the face. Pale, gaunt, eyes wide and bloodshot, skin stretched tight over bones. A mouth cracked and dry, opened and closed, as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. "Help me," it whispered again, the words slurred and unintelligible. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I took a step back, but the figure slowly began to rise, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was coming toward me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure took another step, then another. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was right in front of me. Its cold, clammy hand reached out, brushing my face. I screamed. I turned and bolted down the stairs, not caring if I fell, just wanting to get out of there. The house groaned around me, as though it was alive, the air thick with a suffocating dread. I didn't stop running until I was back on the trail, gasping for breath, the sounds of the forest rushing back into my ears. But even as I sprinted through the woods, I could still feel those eyes on me, that cold touch against my skin. Story 11. I boarded the subway just before the evening rush, hoping to get home quickly after a long day at work. The train was relatively empty, with only a few people scattered across the seats. I settled into a corner, leaning against the cold metal pole, trying to relax as the train rumbled forward. It was the perfect kind of ride, quiet, uneventful, and peaceful, something I appreciated after the chaos of the day. As the train moved deeper underground, I noticed a man sitting a few seats away from me, his face hidden behind the screen of his phone. At first, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't unusual for people to be engrossed in their devices during a late ride. I pulled out my own phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media, but I kept glancing at him from time to time, feeling a strange sense of discomfort. He seemed to be watching me, or at least I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were fixed on me. The train lurched slightly as we passed through a tunnel, and I adjusted my position, trying to focus on something other than the man. Then, in the blink of an eye, I saw his phone screen light up, and I realized he had taken a picture of me. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. Did he just take my photo? My heart began to race as I looked up, catching a glimpse of his eyes through the phone's reflection. He wasn't even trying to hide it. Before I could process what was happening, my phone buzzed in my hand. I glanced at it, expecting a message from a friend or a notification, but instead, I saw an incoming airdrop notification. It was a photo of my photo, and the caption read, "She's the one." I stared at the screen in shock, my breath catching in my throat. I could barely process what had just happened. Someone had taken my photo and sent it to everyone else on the train. I looked around, my eyes wide with panic, but no one seemed to react. The sense of unease crept up on me, growing stronger by the second. I scanned the train, noticing that several people were holding their phones in their hands. Some of them were looking down at their screens, while others were glancing up at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Were they all receiving the photo? Were they all seeing it? I felt exposed, like I was being watched by a dozen strangers, and it was suffocating. I turned my gaze back to the man who had taken the photo, but he was no longer looking at his phone. He was staring at me, his eyes cold and calculating. I couldn't look away. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the air felt thicker with every passing second. What did the caption mean? What did he want from me? The train seemed to stretch on forever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stuck in this nightmare. I glanced around, trying to make sense of what was happening. People on the train were still staring at their phones, but now there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Some of them were looking at me more intently, their eyes darting between me and their screens. I was starting to feel like an exhibit in a zoo, like everyone was silently studying me, but none of them were saying a word. My skin prickled with anxiety. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do. Should I confront the man? Should I say something to the people around me? But what would I even say? The train was getting more crowded with each passing stop, and I could feel the eyes of the other passengers on me. It felt like the walls were closing in. I had to get off, but I wasn't sure if that would solve anything. Would he follow me? Would the photo follow me? I couldn't stay on the train. I had to get out, but the fear of what might happen next kept me frozen in place. The doors slid open at the next station, and a few more passengers stepped on. The man who had taken my photo remained where he was, but his gaze never left me. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel it choking me. My hands were trembling, and my mind was spinning. I needed to get away from him, but I wasn't sure where I would be safe. I slowly stood up, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. The man's eyes followed my every movement. I tried to walk to the door without looking back, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling of being hunted. I could hear the low murmur of voices behind me, and when I reached the door, I hesitated for just a moment. Should I just leave the train? Should I run? I stepped out onto the platform as the doors closed behind me, my breath shaky and erratic. I didn't look back at the train. I couldn't. My mind was racing, my heart still pounding in my chest. What had just happened? I checked my phone again, but the photo had disappeared from the screen. Had it been deleted? I wasn't sure, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I needed to get somewhere safe, away from all of it. The platform was relatively quiet, but my mind was in chaos. I pulled out my phone and looked through my AirDrop history, trying to find any trace of the photo, but it was gone. I couldn't understand it. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of weird prank? But the man's expression was burned into my memory. The coldness in his eyes, the way he looked at me, it wasn't just a joke. I decided to leave the station, not wanting to stay any longer in case the man had followed me off the train. I started walking briskly toward the street, trying to shake the sense of dread that had taken root in my chest. Every passing car seemed to make my heart race faster, and every person I passed felt like a potential threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and I hated it. Story 12. It was a perfect afternoon for lunch. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the city as I sat at one of the outdoor tables at a small cafe. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and coffee, and the sound of people chatting and passing by added to the usual hum of city life. I had taken the day off from work to enjoy some quiet time, a rare luxury for someone who usually had a packed schedule. I was halfway through my sandwich when a man walked up to my table. He was tall, with disheveled hair and a weathered coat that looked out of place in the mild weather. At first, I thought he might be asking for spare change or directions, but instead he just stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he placed a napkin on the table in front of me, then turned and walked away. Confused, I looked down at the napkin. The handwriting was scrawled, uneven but clear enough to read. It said, "Don't go home tonight." I froze, my sandwich halfway to my mouth. The words seemed to hang in the air, their meaning twisting in my mind. Who was this man? What did he mean by that? I looked up, hoping to catch a glimpse of him disappearing into the crowd, but he was already gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. I quickly glanced around the cafe, but no one seemed to have noticed what had just happened. My heart began to race. I was alone, sitting outside with no one to explain this strange encounter to. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was just past 1 p.m. There was nothing particularly unusual about the day so far, and yet something about that napkin, those cryptic words, sent a shiver down my spine. I sat there for a few moments, turning the napkin over and over in my hands, wondering if this was some kind of prank. But the urgency of the message felt too real to dismiss as a joke. I stood up, suddenly feeling a little unsteady. The warm sun felt distant now, replaced by a gnawing unease. I crumpled the napkin and stuffed it in my pocket, not knowing what else to do. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone watching me? Had I unknowingly crossed someone's path? Or was it all a bizarre coincidence? I tried to brush it off as nothing, a fluke. I walked around the block for a few minutes, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But the more I thought about it, the more the message seemed to carry a weight I couldn't shake. It wasn't just a warning, it was a command. Don't go home tonight. As if someone knew something I didn't, something dangerous that was waiting for me. As I walked back to my car, I noticed a few things that hadn't caught my attention before. The street was unusually quiet for that time of day. The usual sounds of traffic and people were muted, replaced by an eerie stillness. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild, fueled by the unsettling encounter, but the sense of dread only seemed to grow. I considered going to the police, but what would I tell them? A strange man left me a napkin with a cryptic message. It sounded absurd even in my own mind. I couldn't bring myself to call anyone and explain what had just happened. Instead, I drove home, the message echoing in my head the entire way. When I arrived at my apartment, the familiar feeling of safety that usually washed over me was gone. I parked my car, sat for a moment, and stared at the front door. Something felt off, like the air itself had changed, thickened with a sense of foreboding. I opened the door slowly, half expecting something or someone on the other side, but the apartment was just as I had left it. I told myself that everything was fine, that I was just being paranoid. I set my keys down and locked the door behind me, but the sense of unease lingered. The apartment, normally so warm and welcoming, now felt cold, distant. I tried to focus on other things, turning on the TV and scrolling through my phone, but nothing could distract me from that nagging feeling. As the evening went on, I found myself checking the locks on the doors more often than usual. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I couldn't stop thinking about that message. The more I tried to ignore it, the more real it became. What if something was waiting for me here? What if the man was right? I took a long shower to try and calm my nerves, but as I stepped out of the bathroom, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The napkin, the one the man had given me, was now sitting on the kitchen counter. I hadn't brought it inside, I was sure of that. I had left it in my pocket when I crumpled it up, but somehow it had appeared in my apartment. There was no logical explanation for it. My breath quickened, and I looked around the room, my eyes scanning every corner. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was as if someone had been in here, moving around while I wasn't paying attention. My pulse thudded in my ears as I grabbed my phone and called the only person I could think of, my friend Rachel. "Rachel, something's wrong," I said as soon as she picked up. "I don't know what to do. A man came up to me earlier today and gave me a napkin. It said, 'Don't go home tonight.' And now, the napkin is in my apartment. I didn't bring it in. It's just here." Rachel was silent for a moment, and I could hear the faint hum of traffic in the background. "You're sure you didn't bring it in yourself?" "I'm sure. I didn't even think to keep it. I threw it in my pocket and I stopped, the words catching in my throat. It's here, Rachel. I'm not imagining it. I'll come over. Stay on the phone with me until I get there. Don't open the door to anyone, okay?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I stayed on the phone with her, walking around my apartment, making sure all the windows were locked and the blinds were drawn. I tried not to let my mind wander, but the longer I stayed there, the more certain I became that something or someone was watching me. There was a knock at the door. My breath caught in my chest. I froze, staring at the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't move, didn't speak. The knock came again, louder this time. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was Rachel. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice thick with worry. "I don't know. Someone's at the door," I whispered. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. "Don't open it." But it was too late. The The handle turned, and the door creaked open slowly. Story 13. I had been out all afternoon running errands and trying to get a few things done before the weekend. The sun was beginning to set as I walked up the stairs to my apartment, the weight of my bag pulling at my shoulder. It had been a long day, and I was ready to collapse into the comfort of my couch, maybe watch a movie or get some takeout. But as I reached the top step and approached my apartment door, something caught my eye. At first, it was barely noticeable. I fumbled for my keys, a bit distracted, but then I saw it. The keyhole on my door, where I always inserted my key to unlock it, was scratched. It wasn't the typical wear and tear you'd expect from frequent use. These scratches were deeper, jagged, like someone had been working at the lock with some kind of tool. My heart skipped a beat as I leaned in closer to get a better look. I ran my fingers gently over the marks, feeling the grooves in the metal. They weren't new. The scratches had been there for a while, perhaps even days. I couldn't remember noticing them before, but now that I was looking, they seemed impossible to miss. Someone had been tampering with my lock. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the keyhole as a wave of unease washed over me. Who would try to pick my lock? My apartment was in a relatively quiet neighborhood, and I hadn't had any issues with neighbors or strange encounters. The thought that someone had been messing with my door when I wasn't home sent a chill through my spine. I tried to push the feeling aside. It could have been nothing, maybe just wear from a key that didn't quite fit perfectly anymore. But as I glanced around the hallway, I noticed that everything was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. There were no sounds of footsteps, no laughter from the other tenants, nothing. It made the air feel thick with tension. I took a deep breath and inserted my key into the lock, trying to ignore the scratches as I turned it. The door opened without any issue, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling in my chest. The idea that someone had been trying to get inside my apartment made my stomach churn. I stepped into the foyer, looking around at the familiar space, half expecting to see something out of place. Everything looked normal. My shoes were still lined up by the door, my coat hung in the closet, and there was nothing on the floor that suggested anyone had been in. But that didn't mean they hadn't been. Whoever had scratched the lock could have easily slipped in while I was out, knowing that I wouldn't be around to notice. I shivered at the thought of someone inside my home while I was away. I locked the door behind me, checking the deadbolt twice before moving deeper into my apartment. It was a small place, cozy but enough for me. I turned on the lights in the kitchen, trying to focus on something other than the scratching sound in my head. I made myself a cup of tea, but every sip felt too warm, too familiar, like it didn't belong in a space that now felt foreign. The more I thought about it, the more I began to piece together odd things that had happened in the past few days. There had been strange noises in the hallway late at night, things I had shrugged off as the building settling. But now I couldn't help but wonder if they were something else, someone sneaking around when the building was quiet, trying to get a look inside. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen anyone hanging around the building, but it didn't mean they weren't there. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a mistake, or maybe someone had just been drunk or careless with their key. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone had been interested in getting into my apartment for reasons I couldn't understand. The scratches on the lock seemed to suggest that it wasn't just random. It felt deliberate, like someone had been trying to break in. I couldn't leave it alone. The following day, I went to the landlord to ask if there had been any incidents in the building recently, any reports of break-ins or strange activity. His face immediately hardened when I mentioned the scratched lock. "We haven't had anything like that reported," he said. his eyes darting briefly to the window as if checking to make sure no one was eavesdropping. But we've had a few complaints about strange noises late at night. I felt a sense of dread pool in my stomach. The landlord didn't seem as surprised as I had expected him to be, almost like he knew something, but wasn't willing to share. He told me to be cautious, to double-check my locks, and that he'd have maintenance take a look at my door. But the way he said it, with that hesitation, made me wonder if he knew more than he was letting on. That night, I decided to do something I hadn't done in months. I locked the door and pushed a heavy piece of furniture in front of it, just in case. I set an alarm on my phone to wake me every hour so I could check the lock and make sure no one had tried to break in again. It was exhausting, and I didn't sleep well. But each time I checked, the lock was still intact, the scratches still there. Silent reminders of the night before. The next few days dragged on, each one blending into the next. I spent more time at home, trying to keep an eye on anything out of the ordinary, but nothing happened. My neighbors were all going about their lives, and I didn't hear any more strange noises in the hallway. For a while, it felt like everything had returned to normal, and I began to relax, to let my guard down. Then, late one night, I came home from work and noticed something different. The scratches on the lock were still there, but now there was a piece of torn paper wedged between the door and the frame. My heart pounded as I pulled it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic. "You should have left when you had the chance." I dropped the paper, my mind racing. Whoever had been trying to get into my apartment was sending a message now, and it was clear that I wasn't the only one who had noticed. Someone had been watching, waiting, and I was beginning to realize just how much danger I was in. I looked around the hallway, half expecting to see a figure watching from the shadows, but the place was as quiet as ever. I locked the door behind me and grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. Something told me that I wasn't going to feel safe here anymore. Whatever had been happening, it wasn't over, and I wasn't sure how far this person was willing to go. Story 14. It was well past midnight when I finally finished up the last of my work. The office was quiet, too quiet, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights above and the soft click of my keyboard filling the silence. The city outside was still, bathed in the glow of streetlights, but I was too tired to appreciate the view. I had stayed late more times than I cared to admit, but tonight felt different, like I was the only one left in the entire building. I was packing up my things when my phone buzzed, its screen lighting up with an unknown number. I didn't recognize the area code, but the text that appeared on my screen made my stomach drop. "You shouldn't be here right now." I stared at the message for a few seconds, my mind racing. I didn't know anyone who would send me a message like that. I tried to brush it off as a prank, but something about the words sent an unsettling chill down my spine. Maybe it was a wrong number, or maybe one of my coworkers was messing with me, some late-night joke. But why didn't they sign it? Why didn't they include any context? I quickly typed a reply, trying to sound casual despite the growing anxiety in my chest. "Who is this?" I hit send, hoping for a reasonable explanation. But the seconds ticked by and the phone stayed silent. I looked around the empty office, the quiet stretching out between the soft clicks of my fingers on the screen. Nothing about this felt right. Then the phone buzzed again. "Leave now." This time I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The message was short, direct, and much more urgent. My heart started to pound in my chest. Who was doing this? What did they know? Was someone watching me? My first instinct was to call security, but the building was locked down at night, and I knew the guard wouldn't be able to help me unless I had a real reason to panic. and right now I wasn't sure if I was overreacting. I stood up and glanced around, the feeling of being alone in the office suddenly overwhelming. It wasn't just the empty office that made me uneasy, it was the sense of being watched. I walked over to the door, locked it, and checked the window. The hallway outside was dimly lit, empty. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system, but there were no sounds of footsteps, no voices, nothing that would indicate anyone else was around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I returned to my desk and sat down, trying to focus on my work again, but my hands were shaking as I typed. I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for another message. Every little noise in the building seemed to amplify the clicking of the printer in the far corner, the rustle of paper, the wind outside tapping against the windows. Then, the phone buzzed once more. This time it was a photo, a blurry, indistinct image of a hallway in the office building. The angle was strange, as if someone had taken it from behind a corner. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't heard anyone moving through the halls. The photo was eerily silent, as though whoever took it had been stalking the halls while I sat alone in the office. My hands were ice cold as I tried to send a response. "Who are you?" My fingers trembled, making it difficult to type. I quickly checked the time. It was well after midnight now. The building had been empty for hours. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. There was no response for several long minutes. I debated whether to leave. My mind raced with the possibility that this could just be some sick joke, someone who knew I was working late and decided to mess with me. But every time I tried to convince myself of that, the feeling in the pit of my stomach only grew stronger. Then the phone buzzed again. This time the message was different. "I'm closer than you think." I froze, my heart skipped a beat. I glanced toward the hallway again, as if expecting to see someone standing there, just outside the door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out of the building as quickly as possible, but I couldn't move. My body felt like it was stuck in place, my legs heavy as if I had suddenly become paralyzed by fear. I picked up my phone, my hands shaking as I typed out a quick message. "Who are you? What do you want?" But before I could send it, I heard a noise from the hallway, a faint shuffle, a scuff of shoes on the carpet. I shot out of my seat, my pulse pounding in my ears. The noise stopped. My heart raced as I strained to listen for any other sounds, but the building had fallen silent once again. I felt the weight of the silence press in on me. I looked around the room, my eyes darting to the door, the window, the phone in my hand. Then the text buzzed again. "Turn around." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. For a second, I considered just leaving the building, running to my car and driving away. But something told me that if I did, it would only make things worse. I slowly turned in my chair, my eyes scanning the office. There was nothing behind me. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked cautiously toward the door, every step feeling like it echoed in the empty office. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could open it, my phone buzzed again. This time there was no message, just another photo. This time the photo was clearer. It was a picture of my office door, taken from the outside just as I was about to open it. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone was outside. Someone had been watching me, waiting. I felt my heart race as I backed away from the door, the cold sweat forming on my forehead. I was no longer alone, and I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my bag, rushed to the stairwell, and ran down the flights of stairs, not stopping until I was out in the parking lot, gasping for air. My car was parked near the entrance, and I didn't hesitate before I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove away. I never looked back, but the image of that photo and the feeling of being hunted stayed with me for a long time. To this day, I still don't know who sent those texts. I haven't returned to that office late at night since. I still get the occasional text from unknown numbers, but nothing ever comes through. No more photos, no more messages, just silence. But I can never shake the feeling that someone is still watching. Story 15. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the air felt cool but not cold, and the streetlights flickered faintly against the dusk. I had just left work and was driving home when I noticed the low fuel light flash on. With a sigh, I pulled into the nearest gas station, a small, out-of-the-way place that I frequented because it was never busy. The hum of the neon sign was the only sound as I stepped out of my car to fill up. As I placed the nozzle into my car, I heard the slow rumble of an engine behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, and a white van was pulling into the lot. It was old, the paint chipped, and it had an unmarked, almost plain look to it, nothing too strange, just another vehicle passing through, or so I thought. But then, the van stopped right next to my car, just a little too close for comfort. The engine cut, and the driver's side window rolled down. A man in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, looked at me with a friendly, almost too friendly smile. His eyes were a little too wide, and there was something in his expression that made me uneasy. "Hey there," he called out. "Need a ride somewhere? I can take you wherever you're headed." His voice was calm, almost too calm, with an edge of friendliness that felt forced. I hesitated, my hand still on the gas nozzle as I tried to gauge his tone. It wasn't the kind of offer you expected from someone at a gas station, especially not when I was clearly in my own car. "No, thanks," I replied quickly, trying to keep the conversation short. "I'm good, just filling up." I gave him a polite but firm smile, hoping that would end the interaction. The man didn't seem to take the hint. He smiled again, this time wider, showing too many teeth. "Oh, come on," he said, leaning slightly out of the van. "It's no trouble at all. I'm just trying to help out. Where are you headed? I can give you a ride, save you some time." I felt a tightening in my chest, the unease turning into something more visceral. Something wasn't right. His eyes lingered a little too long on me, scanning me in a way that felt invasive. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a simple offer to help. Maybe it was the way he stared or the way he circled the gas station lot before pulling up next to me. It all felt too deliberate. "I'm really fine," I said, trying to sound more confident. I turned back toward my car, hoping he would take the hint. But the van didn't move. Instead, it sat there, idling, its engine humming softly. I looked down at the gas pump, willing it to finish so I could get back in my car and leave. The seconds felt like minutes as I waited, and the man stayed there, his eyes following every move I made. I finished pumping the gas and clicked the nozzle back into place, all the while keeping an eye on the van. As I started to close the fuel cap, I glanced over again. The man was still watching me, not making a move to leave, just staring with that unnerving smile. My hand shook slightly as I adjusted the cap, and I forced myself not to look directly at him anymore. I wanted to believe that this was just a simple case of someone being overly friendly, but deep down I knew it was something more. When I finally closed the door to my car, I started to get in, my hand reaching for the handle. But before I could open it, the man spoke again. "Hey, you sure? It's not safe out here at night. People can be unpredictable, you know. I can take you wherever you need to go." I froze, my hand hovering just above the door handle. I wanted to tell him to leave, to just go away, but something in my gut told me that would only make him more persistent. He was testing me, seeing how far he could push. My mind raced, thinking of all the possible scenarios. The area around the gas station was quiet, too quiet, and I suddenly felt like I was a little too exposed out in the open. I needed to get out of here. "Really, I'm fine," I said, a little louder this time, my voice firm. "I'm good. I'm going home now." The man paused, and for a moment it felt like the world around us went silent. I felt his gaze on me, heavy and unblinking. Then, finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he sighed. All right," he said, rolling his eyes dramatically. "Suit yourself." The van's engine sputtered back to life, and slowly, almost reluctantly, it began to pull away. I stayed where I was, my hand still on the door, watching the van as it circled the lot. I told myself to breathe, to calm down, but the man wasn't leaving. Instead, he drove slowly, too slowly, around the edge of the lot, his headlights cutting through the darkness. I kept my eyes on him, my heart pounding in my chest. What was he doing? The van didn't drive straight through the exit. Instead, it took a wide turn, looping around the back of the gas station, its headlights now pointing directly toward me. He wasn't leaving, he was circling. I could feel my stomach drop. What the hell was going on? I waited for a few seconds, frozen, watching him as he drove around the back and then turned again, coming back toward me. His eyes were on me now. His gaze locked in a way that made every instinct in my body scream at me to get out of there. My mind raced. Was he going to stop again? Was he going to ask me for something else? Was he going to? Just as the van began to make another slow pass, I grabbed the door handle, threw myself into the car, and slammed the door shut. I threw the car into reverse, my hands shaking as I backed up quickly, then sped forward, not looking back. The van, thankfully, kept driving, and I didn't see it again. I drove home that night with my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of the engine in my ears, and the feeling of being watched still lingering over me. The whole encounter kept playing over in my head, replaying every word, every movement, every glance the man had made. The fact that he didn't leave, that he circled the lot like a predator, made the encounter feel even worse. I tried to tell myself that it was probably nothing, just a man being strange, but deep down I knew better. There was something off about it, something that felt wrong. And every time I passed the gas station on my way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I had narrowly avoided something much worse. Story 16. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon as I walked out of the grocery store, bags in hand. I was exhausted from a long day at work, and all I wanted to do was get home, put the groceries away, and relax. But as I approached my car, something caught my eye. There was a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. It was strange. I hadn't seen anyone around my car when I entered the store, and there had been no sign of trouble. I stepped closer, a mild curiosity piquing my interest. As I reached for the paper, I immediately recognized it. It was a receipt. At first glance, I thought it was just a random receipt from someone else, maybe blown into my parking spot by the wind. But as I unfolded it, I froze. The receipt was for the exact items I had purchased that day, with everything I had bought listed in neat rows. The time was stamped in the corner, showing the exact moment I had paid for my groceries. My heart skipped a beat as I examined the receipt further. It wasn't just the list of items that unnerved me, it was the red circles. The items I had purchased that day were marked with thick red pen, and the timestamp was circled as well. Whoever had done this had taken the time to write everything down, to note my exact actions. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I looked around, suddenly feeling very exposed. I quickly looked around the parking lot, but there was no one in sight. The few cars that remained were parked far away, their drivers presumably inside the store or heading home. I glanced at my car's windows and door handles, checking for any signs of tampering. Everything seemed normal, but that receipt with its bizarre details didn't make sense. It wasn't a simple mistake. Someone had deliberately left it for me. I slid into my car and locked the doors, my mind racing. Who had done this, and why? I thought back to my day. Had I been followed? Was I being watched without knowing it? I had gone about my business normally, with no unusual encounters or strange behavior. I couldn't recall anyone paying particular attention to me. Yet, here was a receipt showing that someone had been tracking my every move. As I started the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The receipt still lay on the passenger seat, staring back at me. I held it in my hands for a moment, trying to make sense of it. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the more I thought about it, the more unnerving it became. This wasn't just a prank, it felt personal. I drove home in a daze, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror every few seconds. My mind kept wandering back to the receipt and the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. What if they had been following me for days or even longer? Had I noticed anything strange before? Nothing came to mind, but the receipt made me question everything. When I got home, I immediately checked my car again. I walked around it twice, inspecting the tires, the windows, the doors. There were no signs of tampering, no fingerprints, no scratches, no broken glass. I even checked under the car, half expecting to find something hidden there. But everything appeared fine. Still, the feeling of unease lingered. I sat down at the kitchen table and spread the receipt out in front of me. I studied it again, trying to find any hidden meaning. Maybe it was a mistake, some random slip-up. But the circled items, the precise time, it all felt deliberate. I tried to recall if I'd noticed anyone following me at the store, anyone who seemed interested in my purchases. But I hadn't paid attention to the people around me. I'd been focused on getting in and out quickly. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every flicker of the lights made my heart race. I kept thinking about that receipt, how it had ended up on my windshield, who had written it, and why. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched, that someone knew my routine, knew exactly where I'd be at a certain time. The idea was suffocating. The next morning, I called the store to see if there were any security cameras that might have caught something. The woman on the phone was polite, but didn't seem to think it was anything to worry about. She assured me that the store's cameras wouldn't have recorded anyone leaving something on my car, as they mostly focused on the checkout area. She suggested it might have just been a mistake, but that answer didn't sit right with me. It didn't explain the red pen markings or the detailed nature of the receipt. I decided to take a different route to work that day, just in case someone was watching me. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being followed. The feeling of being paranoid was overwhelming, but I couldn't shake it. Every time I passed a car or walked into a building, I wondered if someone had been watching me, if they were waiting for me to slip up. Days went by, but the unease didn't leave me. I started to check my car more thoroughly before I got in, peering under the windshield wipers, scanning the parking lot for anything suspicious. I avoided the same grocery store for a while, but the fear lingered. Whoever had left that receipt knew more about me than they should have, and that knowledge was suffocating. One afternoon, as I pulled into my usual parking spot at work, I noticed something strange. A small piece of paper was sticking out from under my windshield wiper. My heart leaped into my throat. I stepped out of the car slowly and grabbed the paper. It was another receipt this time. It was from a gas station I had stopped at a few days ago. The same red circles marked the items I'd purchased, and the time was circled once again. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Whoever was doing this was getting closer. They weren't just following me, they were tracking my every move, and I had no idea how to stop it. Story 17. I returned home late one evening, tired from a long day at work. The street was unusually quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel underfoot as I walked up to my apartment building. I had barely even noticed anything out of the ordinary as I unlocked the door, thinking only of collapsing into my couch and resting for a while. But as soon as I opened the door to my apartment, something caught my eye. There, in the small entryway, was a chair. It was one of my kitchen chairs, the mismatched set I'd picked up at a thrift store months ago. It was positioned directly in front of the door, angled just enough so that whoever had placed it there could easily sit and watch the entrance. The chair was facing the door as if someone had been waiting for me to arrive. I froze for a moment, my hand still on the doorknob. The apartment was quiet, but the strange sight of the chair felt off in a way I couldn't quite explain. No one had been in my apartment, I was sure of it. I had left that morning and hadn't had any visitors since. But the chair, it looked like someone had been sitting there, waiting for me. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. I stepped inside, cautiously glancing around the room. Everything else appeared normal, but the chair in front of the door was impossible to ignore. I placed my bag down on the counter, still trying to make sense of it. Had I somehow moved the chair there earlier and forgotten? No, I was certain it hadn't been there when I left. There was no reason for anyone to have come into my apartment while I was gone. But the more I thought about it, the less I could shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked toward the chair, my heart racing with each step. I knelt down beside it, inspecting the floor for any sign that it had been dragged. The legs of the chair didn't seem to show any unusual marks, but there was a faint scent in the air, something unfamiliar, something faintly musty. It wasn't a smell I recognized from my apartment. It felt out of place. I stood up, trying to steady my nerves, and glanced back at the door. There was no sign of forced entry. The locks were intact, and the door hadn't been tampered with. My mind raced with possibilities. What could someone have used a spare key? Had someone been watching me from outside, waiting for me to leave before they made their move? The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. I reached for my phone, my hand shaking slightly, and considered calling the building manager or even the police. But then the rational part of my brain told me to calm down. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Maybe I'd simply forgotten that I had moved the chair before leaving, or maybe it had been a harmless prank. But why hadn't I noticed it before? I decided to check the rest of the apartment, looking for anything out of place. As I moved through the rooms, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just an odd coincidence. But when I reached my bedroom, my stomach dropped. The blanket on my bed, which had been neatly folded that morning, was now disturbed. The corners were slightly askew, and the pillow that I always placed in the middle of the bed was now shifted to one side. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. The more I searched, the more signs I found, small things, almost imperceptible. A book on the coffee table was flipped open to a page I didn't remember reading. A mug on the counter that had been placed in the dishwasher that morning was now sitting on the edge of the sink, as if someone had used it and forgotten to put it away. I didn't know how I hadn't noticed these things earlier. It didn't make sense. I had been gone for hours, and nothing seemed to have been taken. Nothing was broken or damaged. but someone had clearly been here, and I didn't know why. I could feel my pulse quickening as I realized that whoever had been inside my apartment had been careful, deliberate in their actions. They hadn't stolen anything, but they had certainly made their presence known. I walked back to the entryway, my mind spinning with possibilities. The chair was still there, right in front of the door, as though whoever had placed it had been waiting for me to return. The thought made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, even though I knew no one was there. The apartment, once my safe haven, now felt suffocating, unfamiliar. I grabbed my phone again, debating whether to call the police, but the fear of sounding paranoid stopped me. What would I even say? Someone had moved a chair and messed with my bed. I couldn't explain it in a way that made sense. So instead, I did what seemed the safest thing. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking the locks. As I sat on the couch, staring at the chair in front of the door, my mind kept returning to one question: who had been here, and why? I couldn't stop thinking about the way the chair had been positioned, as if someone had planned to sit and wait for me. Had they known when I would return? How had they managed to get inside without leaving any trace? The silence in the apartment felt oppressive now. I couldn't focus on anything except the strange, unsettling feeling that had settled over me. It was almost as if I wasn't alone, even though I was. I kept hearing small noises, creaks in the floorboards, the faintest rustle of air, but every time I looked around, everything appeared still. My phone buzzed, breaking my thoughts. It was a text from a friend, asking how my day had gone. I quickly typed back, telling them I was okay, but that something strange had happened when I got home. As I hit send, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye movement in the hallway outside my apartment. My heart stopped. I stood up, my breath shallow, and crept toward the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I didn't hear any footsteps, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The hallway outside was silent, dark. I opened the peephole and glanced out. There was nothing. No one. But when I turned back to the chair, it was different. It was slightly turned, as if someone had moved it just a little while I was distracted. My heart pounded in my chest. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been here, waiting, watching. And now they were gone. Story 18. I was halfway through my road trip, driving across the Midwest on a quiet stretch of highway. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the flat, endless landscape. I had been driving for hours, and a rest area was the perfect spot to stretch my legs and grab a quick break. I pulled into the small parking lot, noticing only one other car parked near the edge. It seemed like the ideal place to stop, away from the hustle of the road. The rest area was empty, save for a few benches and a small, run-down bathroom building. The doors creaked as I entered, and the smell of damp concrete and stale air hit me. I was alone, or so I thought. The flickering lights overhead gave the bathroom a dim, unsettling atmosphere, and I immediately felt a chill in the air that didn't seem to belong. The mirror above the sink reflected my tired face, the exhaustion from hours on the road settling deep into my eyes. I washed my hands quickly, eager to get back to the car and continue my journey. But as I turned to leave, I noticed the man standing at the far end of the bathroom. He was tall, wearing a faded jacket, his face shadowed by a worn baseball cap. He didn't look at me at first, just stood there staring into the mirror as if lost in thought. His presence was strange, like something wasn't quite right about him, but I couldn't place why. Before I could even take another step, the man turned to face me. His eyes were wide and unblinking, fixated on me in a way that made my skin crawl. "You're being followed," he said in a low, raspy voice. The words didn't make sense. My mind raced, trying to process what he had said, but before I could respond, the man simply walked past me. His footsteps were quiet, almost too quiet, and he didn't make a sound as he exited the bathroom, vanishing into the darkness outside. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door he had just walked through. My heart began to pound, and a sense of unease settled over me. I didn't know what to make of his words. Being followed. By who? I tried to shake off the feeling, but something about the whole encounter didn't sit right with me. I forced myself to step away from the sink and made my way toward the door. As I exited the bathroom, the parking lot was eerily still. The night had fallen completely now, and the only light came from the dim, flickering street lamp near the restroom. I glanced around the empty lot, expecting to see the man, but he was nowhere in sight. My car was still parked in the same spot, but my mind was racing. Could he have meant something? Was someone really following me? I hesitated before getting back into my car. The shadows stretched across the lot, and I suddenly felt very alone, as if the whole world had gone quiet around me. I looked at the rearview mirror and checked the area behind me before starting the engine. I had no reason to be paranoid, I told myself. It was just some strange encounter. People say weird things all the time, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. As I pulled out of the rest area, I tried to focus on the road ahead. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves on the trees lining the highway, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a car tailing me, just as the man had warned. But the road behind me was empty, nothing but the occasional passing truck. Minutes passed, and I tried to push the thought out of my head. It was just a rest stop. It was just a random encounter with a strange person. But then, something caught my eye, a dark shape in the distance, far behind me. My heart skipped a beat as I saw headlights in the mirror. It was a car, but I didn't remember seeing it at the rest area when I had left. The road was empty for miles, and the vehicle seemed to be following my every move. I took a sharp turn onto another stretch of highway, trying to lose it, but the car behind me turned as well. My palms grew sweaty, and my breath quickened. The headlights grew brighter, closing the distance between us with every passing second. I had no idea if I was just overreacting, but the unease from the bathroom lingered like a dark cloud. I sped up, hoping to shake the car, but no matter how fast I went, it stayed right behind me. Every time I turned, it followed. It was like the car was reading my mind, anticipating my every move. My nerves were shot, and I had to force myself to stay calm. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, the sound of tires on asphalt blending with the hum of the engine. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to do something. I made a sudden decision to pull off at the next exit, hoping to lose the car. The tires screeched as I took the turn, and I pushed my car faster than I should have. But when I glanced in my rearview mirror, the car was still there, just behind me, its headlights gleaming like twin eyes in the night. I took another turn, weaving through a small town, hoping to confuse whoever was behind me. But as I glanced back again, the car had disappeared. The street behind me was empty. The road stretched out quiet and lonely. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more unsettled. Had I lost them, or had they just vanished into the night? I kept driving, my hands shaking on the wheel, and tried to focus on the road ahead. The events at the rest area and the strange man's warning had set my mind racing. What if he wasn't just some random weirdo? What if there was something to his words? I couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had meant something, that it wasn't just a coincidence. I reached the next town hours later and pulled into a small gas station. The sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. My hands were still trembling as I filled the tank, my eyes darting around the empty parking lot. I couldn't help but wonder, was someone still following me? Or was it just my mind playing tricks after a long night on the road? As I finished pumping the gas, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a car pulling into the lot. But all I saw was the road, stretching out into the horizon, empty and quiet. And yet, despite the stillness of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me just beyond the horizon. I got back in my car, determined to put this strange encounter behind me. But as I drove off, I couldn't help but wonder if the man in the bathroom had known more than I realized, and if, in some strange way, he had just given me a warning I couldn't fully understand yet. Story 19. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft ding as I stepped inside. I was in the middle of a long, stressful day at work, and the last thing I wanted was another delay. But the building was tall, and it was the quickest way to get to the ground floor. I pressed the button for the lobby and leaned back against the wall, letting the slow hum of the elevator's motor calm my mind. The elevator was empty, save for me and a man who stepped in just as the doors closed. He looked ordinary enough about my age, dressed in a dark suit, his hands tucked into his pockets. He didn't even glance at me as he stood there, facing the doors, his back slightly hunched. For a moment I thought nothing of it. People often stay quiet in elevators, and I wasn't in the mood for small talk. Then, without warning, he pressed the emergency stop button. It was a strange, unsettling move, considering that we were barely halfway down. I froze, my eyes darting from the button to him, but he didn't react. He just stood there, staring straight ahead, not a hint of emotion on his face. My first instinct was to ask why he'd pressed the button. I even opened my mouth to speak, but something about the silence made me hesitate. The air in the elevator suddenly felt thick, heavy. The hum of the motor was replaced by an eerie stillness. I glanced at the display, still 2 floors to go, and then back at the man. He hadn't moved an inch. His eyes were fixed on the elevator doors, his face blank, his breathing steady. But there was something in the way he stood there, as though he wasn't just waiting for the elevator to start again. He was waiting for something else. A few seconds passed and I could feel the tension building. I wasn't sure why, but a chill ran down my spine. His presence felt oppressive, like he was occupying more space than he should have been. I looked around, but there was no way to escape. The small space, the flickering fluorescent light overhead, the quiet hum, it all felt suffocating. I thought about hitting the emergency stop button again to restart the elevator, but I didn't want to antagonize him. There was something unsettling about him that made me want to avoid confrontation. He hadn't said a word, hadn't even looked at me, but his presence was enough to make me feel trapped. Time seemed to slow, and the silence became unbearable. I shifted my weight, trying to ease the tension in my legs, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. I caught myself staring, wondering if he was even aware of my presence, but he didn't react. He didn't acknowledge me in any way. It was as if we weren't even in the same space. The weight of his silence was crushing, and my pulse quickened. I could feel my hands begin to sweat as I fought the urge to speak, to break the silence. But I didn't want to say the wrong thing, and the idea of drawing attention to myself seemed worse than staying quiet. I shifted on my feet, staring at the illuminated buttons on the panel in front of me. The ding of the elevator finally broke the silence, but it wasn't the comforting sound I had hoped for. It was the sound of the floor number changing. The doors didn't open. The elevator didn't move. The man hadn't pressed any other buttons. It was as if he was waiting for something, waiting for me to make the next move. I could feel the panic creeping up on me. The longer I stayed in this strange, silent standoff, the more my anxiety grew. I didn't know how to respond to him, to the situation. I wasn't sure if I should ask him why he'd stopped the elevator, or just hit the restart button myself. But there was something about the way he stood there, his stillness so unnerving, that made me hesitate. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My finger hovered over the restart button. It felt like I was defying some unspoken rule, like I wasn't supposed to do it. But the silence was unbearable. I hit the button to restart the elevator, and almost immediately the elevator began moving again. The sudden motion startled me, and for a brief moment, I glanced at the man, expecting him to react, to say something. But he didn't. He didn't even look at me. His gaze remained fixed on the doors, and it was as though I hadn't done anything at all. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The relief of the elevator moving again almost immediately overshadowed by the odd sense of dread that lingered. We reached the lobby floor without another word. The doors slid open with a soft ding, and I almost stepped out without looking back. But as I moved to exit, I noticed something strange. The man's eyes, he hadn't blinked once the entire time. It was like his eyes had been locked in place, focused solely on the doors. There was no sign of movement, no sign that he was a normal person at all. It was as if he wasn't even human. I paused for a moment, my hand gripping the door frame. Something urged me to leave quickly, to not make eye contact with him. I stepped out of the elevator, my feet moving quickly toward the lobby doors. But as I turned to look at the elevator one last time, I saw him. He was still there, standing in the exact same position, his eyes locked on me. It was then that I realized the eerie silence wasn't the most unsettling part of the experience. It wasn't the fact that he hadn't said a word, or that he had pressed the emergency stop button for no apparent reason. It was the fact that, even after all of that, he hadn't moved an inch. He hadn't taken a single step. He was still watching me. And as I exited the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, in some way, he was still following me. Story 20. It was a quiet evening as I walked to my car in the nearly empty parking lot. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow across the rows of parked vehicles. Most of the shops in the strip mall had closed by now, and the lot was eerily still. The only sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the nearby trees, and the soft click of my shoes on the asphalt as I made my way to my car. I was tired from a long day at work, ready to head home and put the events of the day behind me. As I approached my car, a beat-up sedan parked a few spaces away caught my attention. I hadn't noticed it when I first entered the lot, but now it seemed to be right in my line of sight. The driver's side window was rolled down just enough to see a man sitting inside. He was older, with a scruffy beard and dark sunglasses, even though it was well into the evening. He was staring straight ahead, not at me, but at the empty space in front of him. Something about the way he sat there, motionless, struck me as odd, but I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to just another person in a parking lot. I slid into my car and reached for the keys, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. Before I could start the engine, I heard a faint sound, a low, slow roll of a window. I froze for a second, unsure if I had imagined it, but then the sound came again. I glanced up and saw the man's face emerging from the shadow of his car, his sunglasses still on. He was looking directly at me now, his expression unreadable. The man spoke in a slow, deliberate voice. "Do you live around here?" I felt a chill run down my spine. His question seemed so out of place. I had never seen this man before, and there was no reason for him to be asking me about where I lived. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but all I could think was that something about it felt wrong. His tone wasn't friendly, nor was it casual. It was almost like he was testing me, watching me to see how I would react. I looked around quickly, hoping someone else might be nearby, but the lot remained deserted. There was no one else around. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. My instinct was to drive away, to ignore him and get out of there as quickly as possible, but I couldn't bring myself to just leave without saying anything. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe he was just an ordinary person asking a simple question. I forced myself to meet his eyes, which were hidden behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses. "No," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "I don't live around here." He didn't say anything at first, just kept staring at me, the silence stretching between us. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't buying my answer. His lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I could sense that he was still studying me, looking for a reaction. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling my palms sweat. The man then leaned a little closer to the window, as if he was trying to get a better look at me. "You sure?" he asked, his voice lower this time, almost too quiet to hear. It was as if he was trying to draw something out of me, something I wasn't ready to give. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, I'm sure," I replied, my voice cracking slightly. I wanted to leave, to start the car and just drive away, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. There was something in the way he spoke, something in the way he was looking at me, that kept me frozen in place. For a moment he just stared at me again, his sunglasses still hiding his eyes. I couldn't read him, couldn't tell if he was just a harmless person, or if there was something darker going on. He didn't move, didn't speak, and the silence between us felt like it was stretching too long. My heart was racing now, the thudding echoing in my ears. Just when I thought the situation couldn't get any more uncomfortable, the man finally spoke again, his voice a little louder this time. "You don't seem like you're from around here. But then again, people who aren't from around here usually act like that." The way he said it made my stomach drop. I felt a knot tighten in my chest, and every instinct in me screamed to get out of there. His words felt like a warning, like he knew something about me that I hadn't said. But how could he? He didn't know anything about me. I hadn't said a word to him beyond answering his question. I forced myself to look away from him, my hand trembling as I reached for the ignition. But before I could turn the key, I heard his voice again. "You don't need to be scared," he said, almost as if he were reassuring me. But it didn't feel reassuring at all. It felt threatening. "I just wanted to know if you live around here. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'll see you again sometime." I didn't wait to hear any more. My hands were shaking as I slammed the key into the ignition and started the engine. I didn't even bother to look in the rearview mirror. I just put the car in drive and sped out of the parking lot, my heart hammering in my chest. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced quickly in the side mirror. The man's car was still there, but he wasn't in sight anymore. I tried to tell myself that I had overreacted, that it was probably just a strange encounter with an odd person, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't right. His question, his tone, the way he watched me, it all felt too calculated, too deliberate. He had known something, or maybe he just wanted me to think he did. The drive home was tense, every shadow along the side of the road making me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man's car following me, but nothing happened. I got home and locked the door behind me, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread that still clung to me. I thought about the man's words long after I'd settled into bed. "Maybe I'll see you again sometime." I couldn't stop wondering if that was a threat or just a weird comment. Either way, I didn't want to find out. I made a mental note to avoid that parking lot in the future. Something told me that if I went back, I might not be so lucky the next time. Story 21. It was a typical Tuesday evening when I noticed something strange on my phone. I had been out for most of the day, running errands and grabbing coffee with a friend. But when I opened my social media accounts, I saw a series of new posts I didn't remember making. There were pictures not of the usual content I shared, but of my apartment, specifically the living room and kitchen, both of which I knew I hadn't shared with anyone. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I stared at the photos on my feed, a sense of unease spreading throughout my body. The photos weren't just of any room, they were detailed, capturing the little things that only someone who had been inside my apartment would notice. The cluttered coffee table, the half-open blinds on the window, and even the bowl of fruit I'd left out on the counter earlier that morning. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been in my home while I was gone, and now they were posting about it for everyone to see. I quickly opened my other social media accounts, hoping it was just a mistake. But it wasn't. The same photos had appeared on Facebook and Instagram as well. I immediately went to change my passwords, my hands shaking as I typed. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. How had this happened? How had someone gotten access to my accounts, let alone taken those pictures? I quickly checked my phone's camera roll, hoping that maybe I had accidentally uploaded something while scrolling. But there were no new pictures in my gallery, no selfies, no random snapshots, just the usual photos I'd taken of friends, places, and food. The next few moments felt like a blur. I tried contacting customer support for each social media platform, but I wasn't getting any useful information. They told me to wait for a response, but time seemed to crawl by as I paced back and forth in my living room. It wasn't just the photos that freaked me out, it was the fact that whoever hacked my accounts had been inside my home, taking the photos without me knowing. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How had they gotten in? Was there a break-in I hadn't noticed? I took a deep breath, trying to calm my mind. I knew I had to take action. The first thing I did was call the building's management to see if anyone had entered my apartment recently. Maybe it was a maintenance worker or someone from the management team who had been in without me realizing. They assured me that no one had come to my unit while I was out, which only added to the feeling of dread building inside me. Whoever had done this hadn't been through the front door. That much was clear. I walked around my apartment, checking every window and door, making sure everything was locked. I knew I had locked everything before leaving, but the thought that someone had somehow gotten inside without a trace made my skin crawl. The photos on my phone weren't the only thing unsettling about the situation. It was the idea that someone had been in my personal space, observing my life without me knowing. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like there were eyes on me even though I was alone. I called my friend who I'd been with earlier in the day and explained what was happening. They were just as shocked as I was, but they suggested I call the police. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but I knew it was the right choice. I needed to file a report and make sure I was taking all the necessary precautions. When the police arrived, I explained everything in detail, showing them the posts and the photos that had been uploaded. They seemed concerned, but they also made sure to reassure me that they would investigate. As they took notes and asked questions, I kept thinking about the photos. They were so specific, so intimate. The way the light hit the couch, The angle of the shot, it was as if whoever had taken them had been standing right there, looking at everything in my apartment like it was their own. I felt violated, exposed. I couldn't help but wonder if they were still watching me, lurking in the shadows. After the police left, I locked myself in my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to think clearly. I couldn't stop staring at my phone, waiting for another notification, another post. I knew the situation wasn't over. Whoever had done this had control over my accounts, and I didn't know how far they would go. What if they had taken more pictures? What if they knew more about me than I realized? I spent the next few days in a daze, constantly checking my social media for new activity, but there was nothing. The photos had stopped, and my accounts were secured once again. The police contacted me a few days later with an update. They had traced a hack to a location near my apartment. But they didn't have much more information. The hacker had used a VPN, masking their location, which made it difficult to track them down. It was as though they had covered their tracks on purpose. Despite their efforts, the police didn't have any solid leads. The hacker was still out there, and I was left to deal with the aftermath. I couldn't stop thinking about how someone had invaded my space, how they'd taken those pictures and uploaded them without a second thought. It was a violation I couldn't shake. Every time I walked into my apartment, I felt like something was off, like the walls were watching me, or worse, like the hacker was still somewhere out there, waiting for the next opportunity. It took weeks before I could shake the constant sense of unease that lingered in the back of my mind. I had my locks changed, installed cameras, and even hired a private investigator to look into the case. But nothing seemed to help. The hacker had disappeared as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind only the unsettling reminder that someone had been in my home, watching my every move. I could only hope that whoever it was would never return, but deep down, I knew I would never feel truly safe again. Story 22. It was early morning, the kind of time when the streets were still quiet and the air had that crisp, cool edge to it. I was out for my usual run, the rhythm of my footsteps matching the beat of the music in my ears. The sun had barely started to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the neighborhood. There were only a few cars on the road, and a distant dog barked from somewhere down the street. It felt like the perfect day to clear my mind. I turned the corner at the end of the block, my legs already starting to feel the burn, but nothing I couldn't handle. That's when I first noticed him. He was standing across the street at the corner, not doing anything in particular, just staring at me. The man was tall, with a weathered face, wearing a dark hoodie that covered most of his features. His presence struck me as odd, but I figured he was just another early riser, waiting for something, perhaps a bus or a ride. As I continued running, I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. My mind kept returning to the man, though. He hadn't been there when I passed by earlier, and I couldn't help but feel like he was watching me. I pushed the thought aside, picking up my pace as I turned another corner. That's when I saw him again. The same man was standing at the next corner, holding a cell phone aimed directly at me. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his eyes hidden beneath the hoodie, but the phone was clearly pointed in my direction. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to process what I was seeing. Was he taking pictures? Recording a video? I couldn't tell, but the feeling in my chest grew heavier with each passing moment. I slowed my pace for a second, wondering if I should say something. Was he trying to get my attention? Maybe I had imagined it, maybe he wasn't even filming me. But the thought didn't ease the unease that was gnawing at me. I kept running, picking up my pace again, and turned the next corner, hoping I'd lost him. But when I rounded the next street, there he was. The man, standing at yet another corner, his cell phone once again aimed at me. This time I could feel the cold sweat starting to form at the back of my neck. How was he getting ahead of me so quickly? I hadn't seen him walking, and there was no sign of him anywhere when I had passed the other intersections. I didn't want to make a scene, but I couldn't ignore the strange feeling building in the pit of my stomach. I turned sharply, darting down a side street. I didn't know why I thought it would help, but it was the only thing that seemed to make sense in my panicked state. As I pushed myself harder, my breathing quickened, and I glanced over my shoulder. For a brief moment I saw the man again, standing at yet another corner, his cell phone aimed at me as if he had been waiting for me to turn down this particular street. How was he always there? My feet pounded the pavement, and I found myself veering off on smaller paths trying to lose him. The streets seemed to twist and wind, but no matter how much distance I put between us, he was always one step ahead. The man's movements were so calculated, so precise, that it felt as if he was predicting where I would go. It was as if he knew exactly where I'd turn before I even made the decision. I kept running, my legs burning and my breath ragged. I told myself to stay calm, but the anxiety was quickly becoming overwhelming. At each corner, at every intersection, he was there, his phone trained on me like a predator locking onto its prey. The sense of being stalked was overwhelming. I wanted to scream, to ask him what he wanted, but the words stuck in my throat. What could I even say? There was no way this could be a coincidence anymore. I finally stopped in a small park, my hands on my knees, gasping for breath. I looked around frantically, but the man was nowhere to be seen. For a moment I thought I had finally lost him. I stood still, listening for any sound, but all I could hear were the birds in the trees and the distant hum of the city. The park was empty, no one else in sight. Maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had been paranoid, or maybe I was just exhausted from the run. But just as I was starting to calm down, I heard the soft click of a camera shutter. My heart froze. I whipped around, and there, standing at the far edge of the park, was the man again, holding his phone up, capturing a picture of me. I could see the flash of the screen from the distance, his phone aimed directly at me once more. His eyes were still hidden beneath the hoodie, but it didn't matter. The message was clear: he was following me, and he was watching me. Panic surged through me. I turned and started running again, not caring about the pain in my legs or the exhaustion weighing me down. I didn't want to look back, but every instinct in me screamed that he was right behind me, his phone still trained on me like a camera ready to snap. I rounded corners frantically, but when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw that he had disappeared again. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, finally stopping near the entrance to my apartment building. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't know what to do. How could I explain this? How could I tell anyone about the man who seemed to be everywhere I went, holding his phone up, capturing my every move? I walked slowly into the building, my hand shaking as I pulled open the door. I glanced around one more time, but there was no sign of him. I told myself it was over, that he was gone, that maybe I had just imagined everything. But as I ascended the stairs to my apartment, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, trembling, and saw the notification, a new message, from an unknown number. The text read, "You can't run forever." I froze. My blood ran cold. I was no longer sure if I was being hunted or if I was just beginning to understand that this was only the beginning. Story 23. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the world outside seemed to move in slow motion. The sun had dipped just low enough to cast long shadows across the floor, and I had just settled onto the couch with a cup of tea when the doorbell rang. It startled me, and I glanced up, unsure of who could be visiting. My phone was on the coffee table, but I hadn't heard it vibrate with any incoming messages. I was home alone, and it was far too early for any of my friends or family to be stopping by. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should check the peephole first, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood up, walked to the door, and peeked through the small circular lens. At first I saw nothing but the usual empty porch, but then my eyes landed on a small, nondescript package sitting on the welcome mat. There was no sign of anyone lingering outside, no shadow moving beyond the threshold, just the package, alone in the late afternoon light. I opened the door cautiously, still unsure whether I should be wary or just chalk it up to a mistaken delivery. As soon as I bent down to pick up the package, I noticed a small note taped to it. It was folded neatly, just like you might find a letter addressed to someone, and it had a simple message written on it in scrawled handwriting. My breath caught in my throat when I read the words, "I liked watching you sleep." I froze, the note in my hand suddenly feeling much heavier than it should. The words echoed in my mind, and I could feel my pulse quicken as a cold shiver ran down my spine. Who would send something like this? My heart raced as I looked around the porch, my eyes scanning the empty street, but there was no one. It didn't make sense. No one knew I'd be home alone, and certainly no one should have been watching me sleep. I stepped back inside and closed the door behind me, carefully setting the package and the note on the kitchen counter. My thoughts raced. Who could this be from? Had someone been watching me from outside my window? I hadn't seen anything unusual in the last few days. No unfamiliar cars parked outside, no strange people hanging around. I was so caught up in my own thoughts that I barely registered the quiet hum of my phone vibrating on the counter. I picked it up and saw a text message from a friend. "Hey, are you okay? I just wanted to check and saw your light was on late last night and got worried." I smiled nervously at the message, momentarily distracted. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I just texted back that everything was fine, that I was just tired. But the weight of the note didn't leave me. I had to know what was in the package. I ripped off the brown paper, revealing a small cardboard box. My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure of what I was about to find. Inside was a soft, worn-out blanket. It wasn't anything fancy or new, just an old blanket frayed at the edges. I picked it up and examined it, but it looked completely ordinary. There was no note inside, nothing else to explain why it had been sent or what it meant. I put the blanket back in the box, my mind swirling. It was clear that someone had been in my space, watching me, and the fact that they had sent something as innocuous as a blanket made everything feel even more unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger. My phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message, it was an alert. I had a security camera system that I rarely checked, but something compelled me to log in. I pulled up the live footage of my front porch and scrolled back through the recent clips. It only took a few seconds for me to find what I was looking for. The timestamp on the footage showed that the delivery had occurred right after I heard the doorbell. I watched as the camera captured a figure approaching my porch wearing a dark hoodie, their face obscured. They seemed to hesitate for a moment before placing the package down gently and walking away. The figure had moved quickly, almost as if they didn't want to be seen, but they hadn't seemed to notice the camera. The video sent a wave of dread over me. Whoever it was, they had clearly known exactly when I was home and when I'd be alone. But what bothered me more was the fact that they had been close enough to watch me, even though I had never noticed anyone outside my windows. It made me question how long they had been watching. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands still shaking as I tried to make sense of everything. Could this be some kind of sick joke? A prank from someone who knew me? I ran through the possibilities in my mind, but none of them felt right. My friends wouldn't do something like this, and I didn't have any enemies, at least not that I knew of. The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. I decided to call the police, even though I felt embarrassed doing so. The dispatcher was polite, but I could tell she wasn't sure what to make of my situation. "There's nothing we can do right now," she said after taking down my information. "There's no crime yet. It sounds like an unwanted gift, but if it happens again, or if you start seeing signs of someone watching you, let us know. Just stay aware of your surroundings and lock your doors." I hung up, my mind still racing. I didn't feel safe, but what could I do? I double-checked every lock in the apartment, made sure the blinds were shut, and tried to calm my nerves. The package, the note, the security footage, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't yet put together. Whoever was behind this was playing a game, and I didn't know the rules. The next few days passed slowly, with no further signs of strange activity. I went about my routine, but the unease never left. Each time I heard a knock on the door or a sound outside, my heart would race. I started sleeping with a lamp on, a slight paranoia creeping into every quiet moment. It wasn't until one evening, a week later, that I received another package. This time there was no note, no identifying marks on the box, just the same small, brown package sitting on my porch. I picked it up, my stomach twisting in knots. Inside was another blanket, identical to the first one, except this one smelled faintly of perfume. And in the corner of the blanket, scrawled in black ink, were the words, "I know where you sleep." The fear hit me all over again. The game had changed, and I was losing. Story 24. The cafe was quiet, the hum of the espresso machine and soft jazz playing in the background, creating a comfortable, almost cozy atmosphere. I was there to escape the noise of the world for a little while, to sit with my thoughts, sipping on a cappuccino and watching the world pass by outside. The table by the window gave me a perfect view of the street, the occasional car passing, and the people going about their day. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I had just taken a long sip from my cup when the barista approached with a fresh cup of coffee in her hand. She slid it across the table toward me with a smile, but there was something odd in her expression, an almost hesitant look, like she wasn't entirely sure if she should be handing it to me. This is for you," she said, her voice soft. "It's from the man 2 tables behind you." I looked up, confused. My gaze shifted to the man she referred to, sitting alone at a small table behind me. He was older, with graying hair and a worn, slightly faded jacket. He didn't look like someone who would go out of his way to send a coffee to a stranger. In fact, he hadn't even glanced in my direction. He was busy, absorbed in his newspaper, his coffee untouched. I glanced back at the cup in front of me. It wasn't the drink I had ordered, not even close. It was a plain black coffee, no sugar, no milk, just coffee. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I hadn't noticed anyone walking over to my table, and the barista had seemed just as unsure as I was. I stared at the note taped to the sleeve, the handwriting neat but strangely deliberate, almost as if it were meant to convey something more than just a simple message. "From the man 2 tables behind you." That was all it said, with no explanation, no context. I felt a chill run through me as I picked up the cup. It wasn't my order, and it was too intentional. I wasn't the type of person who drew attention to themselves, but this felt like something that shouldn't be happening. My heart began to beat a little faster as I looked over my shoulder again at the man. He was still reading his newspaper, oblivious, or at least pretending to be. I turned back to the barista, trying to hide the unease creeping up inside me. "Are you sure this is for me?" She nodded, her eyes darting to the man behind me for a second. "I'm sure. He pointed at you when he ordered it. He said you'd be here." I froze, feeling a knot form in my stomach. He said I'd be here. How could he know that? I didn't recognize him, and I hadn't been to this cafe in months. I hadn't mentioned anything to anyone about coming here. The thought of someone knowing my exact plans, even in a place like this, sent a wave of anxiety through me. "Do you need anything else?" she asked, sensing my discomfort. I shook my head, my eyes flicking back to the man who hadn't moved since I first saw him. "No, thank you." She left, and I was alone with the coffee and the strange, cryptic note. I stared at it for a moment, my mind racing with possibilities. Could this be some sort of mistake? Was it a mistake on his part or mine? Maybe someone else was supposed to receive it, and I had been the one caught in the middle. But if that were true, why hadn't anyone come to take the coffee away? Why had it been handed to me at all? I hesitated for a moment before reaching for the coffee, then decided against it. My fingers brushed the edge of the cup, but I pulled my hand back. The whole situation felt wrong, like something I didn't want to be a part of. It wasn't just about the coffee, it was about the fact that someone knew I was here. I glanced again at the man. His eyes were now scanning the newspaper, his coffee still sitting untouched. Was he watching me? I couldn't be sure. He wasn't looking directly at me, but I had the unsettling feeling that he knew exactly what was happening, that he was aware of my every move. The note, the coffee, the message, it all felt too calculated. I couldn't ignore the creeping sense that I was being drawn into something that I wasn't prepared for. Slowly, I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I needed to leave. My hand hovered over my bag, ready to grab my things and get out, but I couldn't stop looking at the man. I picked up my phone, wanting to text my friend and vent about this strange encounter, but just as I was about to type, I saw him move. He stood up slowly, folding his newspaper neatly in half before placing it on his chair. He didn't look at me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was moving toward me, even though he hadn't made a single gesture to indicate he would. I felt my heart rate spike. Was he coming over? Was this some kind of awkward, forced introduction? I didn't know, but the idea of being approached by this stranger felt suffocating. I turned and made my way to the door, feeling his eyes on me even though I didn't dare glance back. My fingers tightened around the handle of the door as I stepped outside into the crisp, fresh air. I was free now, or at least I thought I was. The anxiety that had been bubbling in my chest for the last few minutes started to dissipate, but it still lingered. Just as I was about to walk down the street, I heard a voice from behind me. "Excuse me." I spun around quickly, startled by the sound of the voice. It was him, the man from the cafe. He was standing in the doorway, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I just wanted to make sure you got the coffee," he said, his voice low but calm. I nodded quickly, unsure of how to respond. "Yes, thank you," I mumbled, my heart still pounding. He didn't say anything more, just gave a slight nod and turned back into the cafe. I watched him for a moment, feeling my breath slow as the door closed behind him. I didn't know what to make of the encounter, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going back to that cafe. Not anytime soon. The coffee, the note, the stranger, it all felt too much like a puzzle with missing pieces, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Story 25. It was a quiet evening when I came home from work. Just the kind of peaceful night I'd been looking forward to after a long day. I parked my car in the driveway, the air crisp at the onset of fall, and walked up to the back door. My steps were slow as I dug around in my bag for my keys, finally pulling them out and unlocking the door. I pushed it open, expecting the usual stillness of my house to greet me. The first thing that struck me was the oddness of the door. It was unlocked. I knew for a fact that I had locked it when I left in the morning. There was no doubt in my mind. The deadbolt clicked firmly into place before I left, and I always double-check it, a habit I've had for years. But now the door was ajar, the lock disengaged, and the house felt too quiet, almost too empty. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I stepped inside. My senses heightened immediately, alert to every creak and crack of the house. The feeling of being watched brushed against the back of my neck, and I scanned the dark hallway in front of me. No sign of forced entry, no broken windows or signs of a struggle. It was just wrong. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but the door being unlocked was a red flag that wouldn't let me shake the uneasy feeling creeping into my bones. I stepped cautiously further into the house, my footsteps muffled against the carpet. I made my way through the kitchen and into the living room, checking each room along the way. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The dishes in the sink, the mail piled up on the counter, the throw blanket I'd draped over the couch earlier that morning. But something was different, something was out of place. When I reached the living room, my eyes immediately fell to the floor. There, in the middle of the room, was a coin. A single coin placed perfectly in the center of the room. I froze in place. I didn't recognize it at all. It wasn't one of mine, and it definitely wasn't from any coin collection I owned. I knelt down slowly to get a closer look, my pulse quickening with every second. The coin was old, its edges worn, and it had a strange, intricate design on it, something I had never seen before. It didn't resemble any currency I had ever come across. I reached out and picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It was cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so, and the metal had a dull shine to it, like it had buried for years. The markings on the coin were unlike anything I could identify, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant to mean something. I ran my fingers over the raised edges, tracing the mysterious symbols, and I felt an eerie sensation wash over me. Something was off about this coin, something deeply unsettling. I quickly stood up, the coin still in my hand, my mind racing. Had someone been in my house while I was gone? And if so, why had they left just a single coin in the middle of the room? It wasn't like a typical break-in. No valuables were missing. The house was quiet, undisturbed, and yet it felt as though something had shifted, something unseen. The air around me seemed heavier now, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I moved toward the back door to make sure it was properly secured, my mind not entirely focused on the task at hand. I was still staring at the coin, turning it over and over in my fingers as I absently checked the lock. The latch clicked into place with a satisfying sound, but the unease remained. I locked the door again, for good measure, and set the coin down on the kitchen counter. I needed to think. My eyes kept drifting back to the coin as I walked around the house, checking every room one more time. The silence was oppressive. There were no signs of anyone being inside, no footprints, no disturbances in the dust, nothing. But the feeling remained, hanging in the air like a thick fog. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that it was just some strange coincidence or a forgotten detail I had missed. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had changed. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the coin. It glimmered faintly under the overhead light, as though it had some kind of hidden energy. I took a deep breath and tried to push away the creeping paranoia that was clawing at the edges of my thoughts. What if it was just a prank? What if someone had come in, left the coin as a joke, and then left? But I couldn't explain the sensation of unease that clung to the room, or the fact that the door had been left unlocked when I was certain I had locked it. I picked up the phone and called a friend, hoping for some reassurance, some rational explanation for what had happened. But when I recounted the events to them, they only seemed to grow concerned. "That's creepy," they said, their voice cautious. "Are you sure nothing else is missing? Have you checked everything?" I assured them I had, but the weight of the question lingered in the air. Had I missed something? Was there something else that had been taken without my noticing? I spent the rest of the evening going over every inch of the house, checking behind furniture, looking under beds, peering into closets. Everything was in place. I even checked the windows, making sure they were all locked. But no matter how many times I scanned the rooms, no matter how many times I reassured myself that I was just being paranoid, something gnawed at Simad, on the inside. That night I placed the coin on my nightstand, its cold metal gleaming in the dim light. I tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy, as if someone was still there. I couldn't shake the thought of the coin sitting there on the counter, its meaning unclear but its presence undeniable. It was like a message, a symbol of something just out of reach, something I couldn't understand. The next morning, I woke up early, the unease still pressing against my chest. I went to the kitchen and found the coin exactly where I had left it. But this time it felt even more out of place, more disturbing. I didn't know how or why, but I had a feeling that this was just the beginning of something I wasn't prepared for. Something was coming, I could feel it. And the coin, that strange, mysterious coin, was somehow at the center of it all. Story 26. It was a quiet morning when I decided to take my dog, Max, for his usual walk. The sun was barely up, casting a soft golden light across the neighborhood. As we strolled down the familiar sidewalk, I felt a peaceful calm, the kind of morning where everything seemed right. Max trotted along beside me, his leash in my hand, his ears perked as he sniffed at everything in sight. We passed the old apartment building on the corner, one that had been vacant for months. The windows were dusty, the paint peeling, and the steps creaked whenever anyone dared to walk up them. I had always wondered why it had stayed empty for so long. The place seemed forgotten, as if it had been left behind by everyone in the neighborhood. Max always seemed to pick up his pace when we neared it, so I didn't think much of it as we approached. That was when I heard a voice, clear and direct, calling my name. "Hey, Sarah." The sound was faint, but unmistakable, as if it had come from above. I froze for a moment, my heart skipping. I glanced around to see if anyone was nearby, but the street was still and quiet, not a soul in sight. The only thing that made any noise was Max, tugging at his leash as he continued sniffing along the curb. I looked up at the second-story window of the vacant apartment building. The blinds were drawn, but there was a small gap in them, enough to let me see the faint outlines of the room inside. My first instinct was to think it was someone just trying to get my attention. Maybe a neighbor or someone passing through the building who had mistaken me for someone they knew. But then I noticed something that made my stomach churn. There was no one there. The window was empty. No figure, no movement. It was as if the voice had come from thin air. My thoughts raced. Could it have been an echo or the wind? Maybe I had imagined it, but it felt so real, so distinct. I called Max's name, pulling his leash to get him moving again. He glanced back at me, tail wagging, as if he hadn't heard a thing. I shook off the unease as best as I could and started walking again, trying to push the incident out of my mind. But as I continued down the sidewalk, the feeling that something wasn't right lingered in the pit of my stomach. I kept glancing back toward the apartment building. The windows were still covered, still dark and still empty. It had been a long time since anyone had lived there, so why did it feel like something was waiting for me? I walked a few more steps, but the nagging sensation wouldn't go away. My eyes kept flicking up to that same window, expecting to see someone, anyone, standing there. But the more I thought about it, the more my mind raced. Why had I heard my name? And why hadn't anyone else reacted? It was an odd thing, something that didn't belong in the peaceful routine of my morning. Max suddenly pulled at the leash, snapping me out of my thoughts. He was wagging his tail furiously, looking back at me with a gleam in his eye. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing behind us, no one, no car, no movement. It was like the air had thickened around me, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned back toward the apartment building once more, hesitating before walking back in its direction. There was something about it that felt wrong, something about that voice that didn't sit right. My curiosity, mixed with an odd sense of fear, pulled me closer. Maybe there was some logical explanation for the voice. Maybe someone had been inside the building, hiding behind the curtains, and I had just missed them. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something else I wasn't seeing. Max pulled again, snapping me back to the present. He was tugging toward the corner, eager to continue our walk. But I couldn't help myself. I turned around to glance back up at the second-story window one last time. That's when I saw it. For the briefest of moments, a shadow moved behind the blinds. It was too quick to be certain, but there was a distinct shape, like someone was standing there, watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears, and a wave of cold rushed over me. But the shadow was gone just as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me with only the unsettling feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I didn't wait around to figure out what it meant. I pulled Max's leash, and we briskly walked away from the apartment building, my mind racing. Had I really seen someone? Was I just imagining it? The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. The building was supposed to be vacant. There hadn't been any activity there in months, yet something was drawing me back, like an invisible force. Max seemed to sense my unease. He was walking quietly beside me now, his usual energy subdued, as though he too had picked up on something strange. The entire walk back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as though unseen eyes were tracking my every movement. By the time I got back to my house, I had convinced myself it was nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me. But something about the incident still gnawed at me. I couldn't explain the voice, the shadow behind the blinds, or the deep, unsettling feeling that had settled over me. I thought about going back to the apartment building to see if I could figure out what had happened, but the thought of returning to that window, to whatever it was that had called my name, left me paralyzed. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept thinking back to that moment. The voice had been so clear, so distinct, and yet there had been no one there. I knew I hadn't imagined it, but I also couldn't explain it. The feeling that something was waiting, hidden in the vacant apartment, haunted me long after the sun had set. Max was curled up beside me, his presence a small comfort, but even he seemed unusually still, his ears twitching at the slightest noise. The thought that someone or something had been watching me from that empty window stayed with me long after the day had ended. And no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, the voice calling my name echoed in my mind. Story 27. It was late in the afternoon when I parked my car on the street, just outside a small convenience store. The sun was beginning to dip behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the pavement. I was in a rush to grab a few things, so I didn't think twice about leaving my car on the side of the road. There were no signs, no restrictions, just an empty space with plenty of room. I locked the doors and made my way inside, picking up some snacks and a drink, chatting with the clerk for a minute before heading back out. When I returned, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The street, which had been bustling with cars and pedestrians when I parked, seemed unusually quiet now. It was almost eerie how still everything was, as though the world had paused for a moment. I walked up to my car, reaching into my bag to grab my keys, but as I got closer, something caught my eye. There, on the driver's side door, were deep scratches. At first, I thought maybe it was just a scuff or a small dent. But as I stepped closer, my stomach twisted. The scratches were deliberate, jagged lines cut into the metal. The deeper I looked, the clearer the message became. It wasn't just a random scratch, it was a word. Move. The word was carved in bold letters, its edges rough and uneven, as though someone had used a sharp object to scrape it in a fit of anger. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to check around, to see if anyone was nearby, but the street was still empty, not a soul in sight. I walked around my car, inspecting the damage more closely. The scratches were too precise, too purposeful to be an accident. Someone had done this on purpose. I pulled out my phone, snapping a picture of the damage, my hands trembling. What was the meaning behind this? Why would someone leave such an unsettling message on my car? I couldn't make sense of it. I hadn't had any confrontations recently, no road rage incidents or strange encounters. So why was my car singled out? The idea of someone watching me, waiting for me to return, made my skin crawl. I glanced around again, but the street was still empty. I was starting to feel paranoid, like I was being watched from the shadows. I stood there for a moment, debating whether I should call the police, but part of me wasn't sure if it was even worth it. What could they do about a scratched-up door and a cryptic message? It wasn't like there was a direct threat or a clear indication of who was behind it. After a few minutes of staring at the scratches, I decided to get in the car and drive off, hoping that maybe the whole thing would just feel less unsettling once I was on the move. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine, the hum of the car, almost comforting in the otherwise still evening. But as I put the car in reverse, something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. The reflection of my car looked the same, but in the distance I could see someone walking down the street slowly, deliberately. I froze for a moment, my foot hovering over the brake. I couldn't make out their face, but the figure was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, and walking at a pace that didn't seem quite right. There was no urgency, no reason to walk that slowly on an empty street. They didn't even seem to glance at my car as they passed by, but something about the way they moved sent a chill through me. I quickly turned the car around and drove off, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, but by the time I reached the end of the block, the figure had disappeared. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been watched. It wasn't the first time I'd felt that way. There had been other strange encounters in the past, but this one felt different. A word move burned into my mind as I drove home, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more often than usual. The whole incident gnawed at me, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit no matter how many times I tried to arrange it in my mind. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the scratches. I kept replaying the scene in my head, how the word had appeared, the strange feeling of being watched, the eerie calm of the street. I didn't tell anyone about it right away, worried I'd sound paranoid. But the unease grew, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I needed to figure out who had done this, or at least why. I took the car to a local body shop to get an estimate on the damage. The mechanic there seemed surprised by the severity of the scratches, but didn't ask many questions. When I mentioned the word move, he paused and looked at me with a hint of concern. "We get all sorts of people around here," he said, shaking his head. "Some folks do weird things for no reason. Don't let it get to you." But his words did nothing to calm me. I couldn't stop wondering if this was some kind of warning, or if someone was just messing with me. The idea that someone might have known my routine, that they were out there watching me, made my anxiety spiral. I started to notice things that I hadn't before: footprints in the snow outside my apartment, a car that seemed to always be parked across the street at strange hours. Was I just being paranoid, or was someone really paying that much attention to me? I went to the police station the following week, hoping to report the incident. The officer who took my statement seemed understanding but dismissive. "We get reports like this all the time," he said, scribbling something down. "Could just be some kids messing around. Nothing to worry about unless it escalates." But that didn't make me feel any better. Move wasn't a random word. It wasn't a joke. Whoever had scratched it into my door had intended to send a message, and I was the one who had received it. The thought that it could escalate, that it could get worse, lingered in my mind for days. I started parking in a different part of the city, avoiding the street where my car had been damaged. I found myself looking over my shoulder more than usual, jumping at small noises, wondering if someone was following me. The streets no longer felt safe, the shadows too deep, the silence too heavy. It wasn't just about the scratches anymore. It was the constant, nagging fear that someone was out there, waiting for me to move. Story 28. It was late, the city's usual bustle had quieted down, and the subway platform was almost deserted. The cold night air seemed to settle into every corner of the underground station as I stood, waiting for the last train of the evening. I had just finished a long day at work, my mind tired but still buzzing with thoughts. The platform was eerily empty, and as I checked the time, I realized I was the only one waiting for the next subway. A slight shiver ran down my spine, but I shook it off. When the train finally pulled into the station, it was almost completely empty, save for a few scattered passengers. I boarded the subway car and made my way toward the nearest seat. The car was dimly lit, its lights flickering intermittently, giving the whole train an unsettling feel. I was tired and just wanted to get home, so I slumped into my seat, staring out the window as the train began to move. It wasn't until the doors closed and the train started speeding through the dark tunnels that I noticed him. He was sitting across from me, a man in his mid-30s, his clothes slightly disheveled, with a worn-out coat and scuffed shoes. His face was pale, almost sickly under the dim light of the subway. At first I thought nothing of him, just another late-night commuter, perhaps heading home from a long day. But as I glanced back at him, something felt off. The man was staring directly at me, not in the casual way people sometimes look around the subway, but with an intensity that sent a ripple of discomfort through me. I shifted in my seat, hoping he would look away, but his gaze remained fixed. His expression was unreadable, his face expressionless but somehow unsettling. I tried to avoid looking at him, but there was something magnetic about his stare, drawing me in despite my best efforts to look elsewhere. Suddenly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was small, white, and slightly crumpled at the edges. My heart skipped a beat as he unfolded it slowly, never once breaking eye contact. I couldn't help but feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as he held the paper out. The crinkling of the paper, the only sound in the otherwise silent train car. The paper wasn't just a random scrap. It was something specific, something far too personal. As my eyes locked onto the paper, I saw my full name written across it in large, bold letters. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath becoming shallow as I stared at the piece of paper in his hand. How did he know my name? I hadn't spoken to him. I didn't recognize him at all. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but no logical explanation came to mind. The man held the paper up, his gaze never wavering from mine. He didn't say a word. No introduction, no greeting. He simply smiled, a slow, unnerving smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The smile was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face, his teeth exposed in a way that felt wrong. The dim lighting of the subway car made his expression even more grotesque, the shadows around his eyes making him look as if he were something other than human. It was a smile that seemed to mock me, like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for me to understand something he had already figured out. My stomach twisted into a knot, my hands gripping the seat beneath me as I tried to remain calm. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask him who he was, why he had my name, but no words came out. My throat felt dry, my voice stuck somewhere between fear and confusion. The man didn't seem to care. He continued to smile at me, the paper held up in front of his chest like a sickening invitation. I glanced around, hoping someone else would be in the car, that someone else would see what was happening. But the train was as empty as it had been when I first boarded. There was no one else, just me and this strange man, locked in an unnerving stare. My mind raced, thinking of all the possible explanations, but none of them made sense. Could this be some kind of prank? A mistake? Or was there something more to it, something darker? As the train sped through the tunnels, I noticed that the lights flickered again, a quick, sharp blink before they returned to their usual dim glow. The flicker seemed to distort the man's image for a split second, making him appear even more unsettling. His smile stretched a little wider as if he were savoring my growing discomfort. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced at the exit door, wondering if I could make a run for it when the train stopped. But we were deep in the tunnels, far from any station, and there was no telling how long it would take to get to the next stop. I tried to look away, focusing instead on the map of the subway lines that hung above the doors. But my eyes kept drifting back to him, unable to look away from that creepy smile. It was as though something was pulling me in, some invisible force keeping my gaze locked onto his. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but the thought of what might happen if I did paralyzed me. My mind screamed at me to do something, but my body didn't respond. The man continued to hold the paper up, and after what felt like an eternity, he lowered it slowly. Then, just as silently as he had appeared, he stood up from his seat. I watched in frozen horror as he walked towards the door, his footsteps muffled by the hum of the train. He didn't look back, not once. The moment he reached the door, he stepped off the train just as it slowed at the next station. I stared at the empty space where he had been just moments before, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I was frozen in my seat, unsure if I had just imagined the entire interaction. The train doors closed and the train began to move again, the rhythmic sound of the tracks beneath us offering no comfort. It wasn't until I reached my stop that I dared to get off the train. The moment my feet hit the platform, I ran up the stairs to the street, the cool night air doing little to calm the panic that still gripped me. I didn't look back, not even once. I couldn't shake the image of the man, his smile still etched in my mind, his piece of paper with my name hanging in the air like a ghost. I walked home in a daze, my mind replaying the moment over and over again, trying to make sense of it. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed impossible. How could he have known my name? Who was he? And why had he just smiled at me like that? I still don't have answers. Every time I ride the subway late at night, I wonder if he'll be there again, watching me, waiting for something I don't understand. Story 29. The campsite was peaceful, the air crisp with the scent of pine and earth. I had been hiking for hours the previous day, setting up camp as the sun began to dip below the trees. It was the kind of solitude I had come for. No phone service, no distractions, just the sounds of nature and the gentle crackling of the fire. I had pitched my tent by a small creek, the water babbling softly in the background. It was perfect. And perfect. I had made sure to hang my food in the trees, far out of reach of any curious wildlife, and settled in for a quiet night. The forest around me felt alive with its usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves. I ate a quick dinner by the fire, feeling a sense of contentment as the cool air wrapped around me. Afterward, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight, the warmth from my sleeping bag inviting me to drift off into a peaceful sleep. The night was uneventful, or so I thought. The sounds of the forest were constant, but nothing out of the ordinary. No rustling of branches above my head or whispers in the wind, just the peaceful rhythm of nature. I closed my eyes and tried to ignore the occasional creak of the tent fabric in the breeze. I was used to camping alone, and it usually brought me a sense of comfort. But that night, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a nagging sense of being watched that refused to fade. Still, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. When morning came, I woke up slowly, stretching and blinking in the soft light filtering through the trees. The air was still cool, and a thin layer of dew clung to the grass and leaves. I could hear the creek nearby and the occasional bird call. As I unzipped the flap of my tent, I noticed something odd. The ground outside looked disturbed. There were deep boot prints in the dirt, fresh ones, as if someone had walked around my tent during the night. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped outside, my boots crunching on the dry earth. The prints were unmistakable, distinctive, heavy impressions of a large boot. They circled my tent, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern, but there was no sign of a trail leading up to them. The prints seemed to appear out of nowhere, and as I walked around the tent to inspect them further, I realized something chilling. There were no other prints leading away. It was as though the person or whatever it was had simply vanished. I stood there for a long moment, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with unease. I searched the surrounding area, my eyes scanning for any signs of a person or animal, but there was nothing. The forest stood silent as it always did. No broken branches, no movement in the trees, just the same quiet stillness. I felt a tightness in my chest, a growing sense of dread that I couldn't shake. How had I not heard anything? I was a light sleeper, and the thought that someone had been circling my tent while I slept made my skin crawl. I forced myself to take a breath, trying to calm the swirling panic in my chest. Maybe it was some prank from a fellow camper. I had heard stories of people doing that to others in the woods, sneaking around to scare them. I scanned the trees again, but there was no sign of anyone else nearby. The closest campsite was miles away, and I hadn't seen another person on the trail the previous day. It was just me, alone in the forest. I decided to check the area around my tent more thoroughly. I walked around, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the soft earth, my eyes darting to every shadow, every movement in the trees. But there was nothing to explain the prints, nothing to suggest that anyone had been close. No other sign of human activity, only the eerie, unsettling silence of the forest. I crouched down to examine the prints more closely. They were deep, enough to suggest a heavy step, and they seemed fresh. The dirt around them was still soft, undisturbed. It hadn't rained in days, so the earth should have been firm. But these prints were recent, too recent. As I stood up, I felt a shift in the air. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I felt its eyes on me. But when I looked around, there was no one. Nothing but the trees, the creek, the deep silence. My breath quickened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me from just beyond my line of sight. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind, but the more I stood there, the stronger that feeling became. I decided to pack up and leave. I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me, and staying another night didn't seem like a good idea. I quickly gathered my gear, the sound of rustling fabric and clinking metal filling the otherwise silent space. I couldn't get out of there fast enough, my hands shaking as I rolled up the tent and shoved everything into my pack. The prints were still there, circling, watching. As I threw the last of my belongings into the car and slammed the trunk shut, I felt a sense of relief. The forest, with its stillness and silence, had become something far more sinister in the light of day. As I started the car and drove away, I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror. I expected to see something standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But there was nothing. Only the winding road and the distant silhouettes of the mountains. The further I drove, the more I tried to convince myself that it had just been a figment of my imagination. The footprints, the eerie silence, maybe it had all been a trick of the mind. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me in the night. Something that had circled my tent, watched me sleep, and left its mark without a sound. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to. But the forest was still with me, lingering in my thoughts, the memory of those boot prints haunting me. And as the miles stretched on, I knew that I would never go back to that campsite again. Story 30. It was a Tuesday when the letter arrived. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping my coffee and scrolling through emails when I heard the familiar sound of the mailbox lid clanging shut. I rose from my chair, half-heartedly expecting the usual bills or advertisements, and went outside to check. As I flipped through the contents, a single envelope caught my eye. It was plain white, with no return address, and my name was written in neat, precise handwriting on the front. There was something unnerving about it, but I couldn't place my finger on why. I hesitated for a moment before tearing open the envelope. Inside, there was no letterhead, no formality, just a page torn from a notebook, edges ragged, the paper slightly crumpled. The ink on the page was dark and bold, and in the center, it simply read, "Found you." Nothing else. No explanation, no signature. Just those 3 words, scrawled in a way that felt oddly personal. My pulse quickened as I stared at the message, my mind racing with possibilities. Who could have sent this, and why? I turned the page over, hoping to find something more, maybe an address, a clue, anything, but it was blank. My fingers trembled slightly as I set the paper down on the kitchen counter. I looked out the window, trying to calm the rising panic inside me. The quiet neighborhood outside seemed the same as always. No one in the street, no cars passing by. But the letter in my hands felt like an omen. It didn't make sense. Who would want to send such a cryptic message? I retraced my steps in my mind. I hadn't had any recent confrontations or unusual encounters. I wasn't aware of anyone who might have had a reason to target me. The thought of it being a prank crossed my mind, but it felt too intentional. Too strange. No one I knew would go through the effort of sending a letter like that, at least I hoped not. The message lingered in my thoughts like an echo, "Found you," playing over and over in my head. It was as if the words themselves carried a weight I couldn't understand. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was probably nothing, just some random act, a misguided joke from someone with too much time on their hands. I placed the note back in the envelope, locked it away in the drawer, and went about my day. But the unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting. That night, I found myself double-checking the locks on my doors, peering out the window more than usual. But there was nothing, no sign that anything was wrong. Yet the sense of being followed, being seen, crept in with every passing hour. The next day, I went to the post office, hoping to find some answers. I showed the envelope to the clerk, asking if they could trace it somehow, but she shook her head. No return address, no stamp. It's just a regular letter. Can't help you there. I left the post office feeling more unsettled than before. I had hoped for some reassurance, some clarity, but instead I was left with even more questions. As the days went on, I tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. I returned to my normal routine, but the letter haunted me. I checked my phone constantly, expecting strange messages or calls, but nothing came. My friends and family hadn't heard from anyone suspicious, and I had no reason to believe anyone in my life was involved. But the words "found you" stuck with me, growing heavier each day. One evening I went to bed, hoping sleep would offer some relief, but the nightmares started. I dreamt of shadows following me, whispers just out of reach, figures lurking in the corners of my vision. In each dream, the same phrase echoed through my mind, and every time I turned around to face it, the words "found you" seemed closer, as though the sender was standing right behind me, watching, waiting. I woke up in a cold sweat, the covers twisted around me, and the dark silence of my bedroom felt suffocating. I couldn't tell if the dreams were real or if the fear was beginning to consume me. The next morning, I decided to take action. I made a list of everyone who had access to my address or knew where I lived. Family, friends, co-workers, and even acquaintances I hadn't seen in years. I called a few of them just to ask if they had sent the letter, but no one had. Each conversation left me feeling more isolated, more paranoid. It was on the third night after receiving the letter that I heard it. A soft tapping at my window. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I lived on the second floor of my building, and there was no reason anyone should be at my window at this hour. I tried to reason with myself, maybe it was just the wind, or perhaps a branch scraping against the glass. But when the tapping came again, sharp and deliberate, I knew something was wrong. I got out of bed quietly and tiptoed toward the window, my breath shallow. I peered through the blinds, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. My heart was pounding now, the silence outside almost deafening. I stood there for a few moments, wondering if I had imagined it. But as I turned to step away from the window, I caught a glimpse of something movement, just a shadow. It was gone before I could focus on it, but it was enough to send a wave of terror rushing through me. I called the police that night, explaining everything: the letter, the tapping, the feeling of being watched, but they didn't seem to take me seriously. They took a report, but without concrete evidence, they couldn't do much. I hung up the phone feeling utterly helpless. If someone was stalking me, there was no way to prove it. I was alone in this. The following days blurred together. The nightmares continued. The letter weighed heavily on my mind, and the sense of being followed never left me. Each time I turned a corner, I felt like someone was just behind me, watching. I stopped going out at night, unless I absolutely had to. And even then, I was always looking over my shoulder. But no matter what I did, no matter how careful I was, the words from the letter found you kept haunting me. Then, one day, I received another envelope. This time it was slightly thicker, heavier. I opened it carefully, expecting another cryptic message, but instead, it was a photograph. A picture of me taken from behind, standing on my front porch. The caption below read, "I'm closer than you think."